Hello there. Thank you for being here tonight. Maybe it's late where you are. Maybe the day still hangs around a little. Either way, I'm glad you're here. Tonight, we're travelling to ancient Mesopotamia, to the marshlands between two great rivers, where humanity first learned to write, to build cities, to brew beer and bake bread and measure the stars. And there, in the oldest stories ever written, appears a god who loved humans enough to break divine law, a deity who whispered secrets through reed walls to save humanity from flood, a trickster, a teacher, a cosmic rebel named Enki. Where are you listening from tonight, I wonder? I hope you found somewhere comfortable, somewhere you can let your thoughts settle and drift. We're going to explore Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom and fresh water, the deity who defied the king of gods to preserve human life. His stories were pressed into clay tablets 5,000 years ago, making them among the oldest, written narratives we possess. And in those ancient texts, we find a god unlike the stern rulers of heaven. We find someone who schemes, who teaches, who cares about the mortals he shaped from clay and divine blood. The Sumerians believed Enki lived beneath the earth, in the Abzu, the vast freshwater ocean that fed all springs and rivers. He was the keeper of the Me, the divine decrees that made civilization possible. Writing, metalworking, law, music, brewing, all these came from him. He gave them to humanity as gifts, sometimes stealing them from other gods to do so. And when the gods decided to destroy humanity with a great flood, Enki found a way to warn one righteous man. He couldn't speak directly, that was forbidden. So he whispered to a reed wall, told it to pass the message along. Tear down your house, build a boat, save what can be saved. If these ancient stories bring you comfort, a like or subscribe would mean the world. It helps these whispered myths find others searching for wisdom in the night. Now, settle in. Feel whatever's around you, the warmth, the weight of evening. Let your breath slow. Picture this if you can. Imagine standing on the banks of the Euphrates River 5,000 years ago. The water moves slow and brown, heavy with silt from distant mountains. Reed beds stretch in every direction, tall green stalks rustling in the breeze. The air is warm, humid, smelling of mud and fish and the smoke from cooking fires in nearby villages. Somewhere in those marshlands stands the city of Eridu. The Sumerians believed it was the first city ever built, the place where kingship descended from heaven. And at its heart rises a temple, the Abzu, the house of the cosmic waters. This is Enki's dwelling place on earth. His priests tend eternal flames. His devotees bring offerings of fish and beer, fresh water poured in libation. This god is complicated. He's wise but cunning, creative but chaotic. He organizes the cosmos, assigning each deity their role, each river its course, each craft its divine patron. But he also gets drunk, sleeps with goddesses who aren't his wife, plays tricks on his fellow gods. And yet, when it mattered most, when the supreme god Enlil grew tired of noisy humanity and decided to wash them away, Enki was the one who saved us, not through open defiance, through cleverness, through a whisper to a wall of reeds. The story starts long before the flood, long before the first cities rose from the mudflats. It starts in a world we can barely imagine, when gods walked among early humans, when magic was real as rain, when the boundary between divine and mortal was thinner than breath. So let's go back, not just centuries, but millennia. Back to the land between two rivers, back to the beginning of everything we call civilization. Back to meet the god who loved humanity enough to save it. Take a breath. The journey begins in water and mud. Long before any temple rose, long before the first cuneiform tablet was pressed into clay, the land between two rivers was already shaping the story it would tell, the Tigris and Euphrates. These names are ancient, but the rivers themselves are far more ancient still. They've been carving their paths through Mesopotamian plains for millions of years, carrying snowmelt and silt from the mountains of Anatolia down to the Persian Gulf. The landscape they created is flat, almost impossibly flat, with just a gentle slope that makes water move slow and lazy across the land. Around 8,000 BCE, when the last ice age was finally releasing its grip on the northern hemisphere, this region was transforming. The climate was warming, rainfall patterns were shifting, and the great glaciers that had locked up so much of the world's water were melting, causing sea levels to rise, causing rivers to swell and meander and deposit their rich cargo of soil across floodplains that stretched for hundreds of miles. Imagine standing in this landscape 7,000 or 8,000 years before the Common Era. The rivers are wider than they are now, slower, breaking into countless channels and oxbow lakes and seasonal wetlands. During spring floods, when mountain snows melt, the water spreads across the plains like a vast shallow sea. The land drinks deeply, and when the waters recede, they leave behind a gift: thick black alluvial soil, some of the most fertile earth on the planet. The air would smell of water and green growth. Reed beds would tower above your head, their stalks thick as a child's arm, rustling and sighing in the wind. Waterfowl would darken the sky during migration seasons. Fish would flash silver in the shallows. This was not desert. Not yet. This was marshland. Wetland. A landscape dominated by the meeting of earth and water. Perhaps you'd hear the calls of birds you've never heard before. Perhaps you'd feel the mud squelch beneath. Your feet, warm and alive with crawling things. Perhaps you'd see the flash of a wild boar disappearing into the reeds, or the ripple of a crocodile sliding into deeper water. The Sumerians who would eventually settle here, who would build the world's first cities in this mud and water, they understood something profound. They understood that water is both creator and destroyer, that it gives life and takes it away, that it must be managed, channeled, respected, or it will drown everything you've built. But that understanding was still thousands of years away. For now, in this early Holocene landscape, humans are present but scarce. Small groups of hunter-gatherers move along the riverbanks, following game, gathering wild grains and dates and whatever else the land provides. They fish with bone hooks and woven nets. They hunt with spears and cunning. They live lightly on the land because they have no choice. The stars above this landscape are the same stars we see now, barely shifted in their positions. The constellations the Sumerians would later name, would later associate with their gods, already wheel overhead in their eternal patterns. Orion hunts across the winter sky. The Pleiades cluster like scattered seed. The moon waxes and wanes, marking time in a world without calendars. The rivers keep flowing, season after season, year after year, century after century. They don't know they're preparing the stage for civilization. They just flow, carrying mountains down to the sea, building land grain by grain, creating the foundation on which everything else will rise. Take a breath here. Let that image settle. Because this landscape, these rivers, this meeting of water and earth, will shape everything that comes next. The gods that arise here will be water gods, sky gods, gods of grain and flood and fertility. The myths told here will be flood myths, creation myths emerging from chaos waters. The very writing that preserves these stories will use a word for country that literally means land of the silt. The geography is destiny, in a sense, not completely, not deterministically, but the land offers possibilities, sets constraints, whispers suggestions to the people who will eventually settle here, and those whispers will shape how humans organize themselves, how they worship, how they understand the cosmos and their place within it. The floodwaters rise and fall with the seasons, predictable, mostly, but not entirely. Sometimes the floods come too early, too strong, washing away settlements and herds and the year's stored grain. Sometimes they fail to come at all, leaving the land parched, the crops withering. Living here means living with uncertainty, with the constant awareness that abundance and catastrophe are never far apart. Perhaps that's why the god who would emerge from these waters, the deity who would claim dominion over the fresh water beneath the earth, perhaps that's why he would be characterized by cleverness, by the ability to adapt, to scheme, to find solutions to impossible problems. Water itself is like that. It finds a way. It flows around obstacles. It seeps through cracks. It cannot be stopped, only channeled. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The gods haven't been born yet. The stories haven't been told. The people who will tell them haven't even begun to settle, to plant, to build permanent homes in this landscape of mud and water and possibility. For now, the rivers flow, the reeds grow, The marshlands spread and recede with the seasons. The stars watch from above, patient and eternal, waiting for the moment when humans will look up at them and begin to wonder, to name, to weave them into stories about gods and creation and the ordering of chaos into cosmos. The stage is set. The players haven't yet entered, but the story is already beginning, written in silt and water, in the slow accumulation of fertile soil, in the rhythms of flood and drought that will shape every aspect of the civilization to come. And somewhere in the future, pressed into clay that hasn't yet been gathered, fired in kilns that haven't yet been built, lies a story about a god who lives in water, who loves humanity, who will whisper secrets through reed walls to save what he has made. The water flows on, patient, eternal, waiting. When the first permanent settlements appeared along the riverbanks, they were small, modest, nothing like the great cities that would come later. We're talking about the Ubaid period now, roughly 5500 to 4000 BCE, a span of time longer than all of recorded history since. These early villages were clusters of reed houses, maybe a dozen structures, maybe fewer. The walls were woven from the tall marsh reeds that grew everywhere, plastered with mud to keep out wind and rain. The roofs were thatched, the floors were packed earth, simple, functional, meant to last a season or a few years, not centuries. Picture a small community on the bank of the Euphrates around 5000 BCE, maybe 50 people, maybe 100. Extended families living close together, children playing in the shallows under watchful eyes, women grinding grain with stone mortars, the rhythmic sound of pestle on stone marking the passage of hours, men mending fishing nets, checking irrigation channels, preparing for the next planting. The irrigation channels are new, recent, revolutionary, though the people digging them probably don't realise they're revolutionising anything. They're just trying to solve a problem. The floods come when they come, but crops need water on a more predictable schedule. So someone, at some point, has the idea to dig a channel, to guide water from the river to the fields, to control, in a small way, what nature provides. This is harder than it sounds. The land is flat. Water doesn't want to flow uphill. You have to calculate grades, plan routes, maintain the channels constantly or they fill with silt. But it works, and when it works, you can grow more food, support more people, stay in one place instead of moving with the seasons. The fields around these villages grow barley and emmer wheat. These grains are descendants of wild grasses, slowly domesticated over generations through the simple act of harvesting the best seeds and planting them again. The people here didn't invent agriculture. That happened elsewhere, earlier. But they're adapting it to this landscape, learning what works in silt-rich soil, learning to time planting to the flood cycle. They also keep animals, sheep and goats mostly, descended from wild ancestors in the nearby hills, some cattle, some pigs. The animals provide meat, milk, wool, leather. They also provide manure, which makes the fields more fertile. The relationship is symbiotic, beneficial, creating surpluses that allow populations to grow. But life is still hard, still uncertain. Infant mortality is high, disease is common, injuries that we'd consider minor can be fatal. A broken leg, an infected cut, a difficult childbirth. These things happen, and when they happen, there's little that can be done except hope, pray, appeal to whatever forces might be listening. Perhaps that's when the first shrines appear. Small structures, different from the houses, a special building at the centre of the settlement, or slightly apart from it. Inside, offerings, fish bones, pottery vessels, seeds, whatever the community considers valuable, given to powers they're just beginning to imagine. We don't know what gods they worshipped, if any. The Ubaid people left no writing, obviously. Writing won't be invented for another 1,000 years. We just have their remains, their pottery, distinctively painted with geometric patterns, their buildings, their burials, and from these silent traces we try to reconstruct belief. Some of the pottery shows images. Not many, but some. Stylized human figures with lizard-like heads. What do they mean? Shamans in ritual masks? Deities? Symbolic representations of something we can't grasp? We don't know. We can only wonder, can only acknowledge that these people saw the world differently than we do, understood it through frameworks we've lost. The villages grow slowly, very slowly. A new house here, an expanded shrine there. More fields brought under cultivation, more irrigation channels dug. The population inches upward. Perhaps a settlement reaches 200 people, 300. That's enormous for this period. That's a level of social complexity that requires organisation, leadership, ways of resolving disputes and coordinating labour. And all the while, the rivers keep rising and falling. Sometimes the floods come gentle, sometimes violent, sometimes a settlement is washed away. The work of generations erased in a night of rising water. The survivors rebuild, or move, or merge with another community. This is life on the floodplain. This is the price of fertility. Maybe they tell stories about the floods. Maybe they develop explanations. The waters are angry, or hungry, or testing us. Maybe they perform rituals to appease them, to encourage gentle floods and discourage destructive ones. Maybe they notice that certain offerings seem to work better than others, that fish given to the river please it, that beer poured into the water brings favour. These aren't written down, can't be, but they might be passed along, parent to child, elder to youth, the old ones who remember the great flood 30 years ago, who saw the water rise higher than anyone thought possible, who watched whole villages disappear. They tell the young ones, be careful, be respectful. The water gives, but the water also takes away. At night, when the work is done, people gather around fires, they eat flatbread and fish stew. They drink beer, humanity's oldest beverage, made from barley and dates and whatever else adds flavour. They talk, tell jokes, argue, flirt, gossip. They're human, fully human. Same brains we have, same emotions, same needs for connection and meaning and hope. And they look up, at the stars, at the moon travelling its monthly path, at planets wandering against the fixed background of constellations. They don't understand what they're seeing, not the way we do, but they watch, they notice patterns, they begin, perhaps, to associate celestial movements with earthly events. When that star appears at dawn, the floods soon follow. When the moon is full, fishing is good. The Ubaid period lasts 1500 years, longer than the Roman Empire, longer than the history of Islam. These weren't primitive people marking time. They were building foundations, developing technologies, creating social structures, establishing trade networks that linked settlements across hundreds of miles. And in those centuries, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something is changing. The villages are getting larger, the irrigation systems more complex, the social hierarchies more pronounced. Certain families have bigger houses, better pottery, more elaborate burials. Inequality is emerging. Specialization is emerging. The seeds of urbanism are germinating in the mud. But the cities haven't risen yet. The great temples haven't been built. The gods haven't been named. For now, there are just villages. Just people farming and fishing and raising families and trying to survive. Just the slow, patient accumulation of knowledge and technique and social organization. Just the rivers flowing, the stars watching, the mud waiting to be shaped into bricks, into tablets, into the foundation of everything that comes next. The world is ready. The people are ready. And soon, very soon in the long count of centuries, the transformation will begin, somewhere in the transition from village to city, somewhere in the centuries when populations swelled and settlements merged and the first true urban centres began to rise. The gods were born, not literally, of course, but in human imagination, in the stories people told to explain the world, in the attempt to give names and personalities to the forces that shaped existence. The Sumerian pantheon didn't appear fully formed. It evolved, grew, changed, absorbed influences from neighbouring peoples, refined itself through centuries of storytelling and ritual practice. The earliest gods were probably simple, elemental, and the sky. Kai, the earth. When sky and earth coupled, the world was born. This is a common creation pattern, found in many mythologies. The cosmic marriage, the primal parents. From their union, everything else emerges. But the Sumerians lived in a particular landscape, a landscape dominated by water. So water gods appeared early. Had to. Water was too important, too powerful, too essential to ignore. Without water, no crops, no fish, no life. But too much water, the wrong kind of water, and everything drowns. Fresh water and salt water needed to be distinguished. The Abzu became the name for fresh water, for the vast subterranean ocean that the Sumerians believed fed all springs and wells and rivers. This wasn't just myth. This was observation. Water came up from the ground. It had to come from somewhere deep, somewhere hidden beneath the earth, and governing that realm, dwelling in those depths, was Enki. Or he would be, eventually. The name might have been different earlier, the characteristics might have shifted, but the basic concept, a deity associated with fresh water, with wisdom, with creative power, this seems to have deep roots in Mesopotamian religion. Enlil came later, perhaps. Or perhaps he was there from the beginning, but in different form. He's the storm god, the wind, the force that separates. Heaven from earth, that brings rain, that can be gentle breeze or devastating hurricane. In the Sumerian cosmos, Enlil becomes king of the gods, supreme authority, the one who makes decisions that bind all others. This creates tension, interesting tension. Enki is older in some traditions, associated with the primal waters from which everything emerged, but Enlil is more powerful, more authoritative. The relationship between them, cooperative sometimes, antagonistic others, becomes central to many myths. Picture it this way: Enlil is order, law, authority, the king who rules from his throne in Nippur, his great temple rising above the city. He expects obedience, demands it. When he speaks, his word becomes reality. This is how the cosmos is organized, how stability is maintained. Enki is different. He's clever rather than authoritative, creative rather than commanding. He solves problems through cunning, through finding loopholes, through schemes that technically obey the letter of divine law while violating its spirit. He's the god who gets things done, but not always in the approved manner. Why would the Sumerians imagine gods this way? Perhaps because they saw both types of power in their world. The king who ruled the city, who commanded armies, who decreed laws. That's Enlil, but also the engineer who designed irrigation systems, the scribe who kept records, the craftsman who invented new tools. That's Enki. Both necessary, both valuable. Often in tension, other gods filled out the pantheon. Inanna, goddess of love and war, fierce and beautiful. Utu, the sun god, bringer of light and justice. Nanna, the moon god, marker of time. Each deity had a domain, a role, a city where they were particularly honoured. This reflected human society. Each city had its patron god, its special relationship with the divine. Temple architecture grew more elaborate as cities grew. The earliest shrines were simple, single rooms where offerings were placed. But as populations swelled, as wealth accumulated from trade and agriculture, the temples grew larger, more complex, multi-room structures, eventually ziggurats, stepped pyramids rising toward heaven, connecting earth to sky. The temple wasn't just a place of worship, it was an economic centre, a storehouse, an administrative hub. The priests managed irrigation systems, distributed grain, organised labour. They were the literate class in a mostly illiterate society. They kept records, calculated taxes, mediated disputes. The divine and the practical were intertwined, inseparable, and they told stories. This is crucial. In a world without writing, or just beginning to develop it, stories are how knowledge is preserved, how values are taught, how the past is remembered. The priests told stories about the gods, about creation, about the ordering of the cosmos, about floods and battles and divine marriages and cosmic adventures. These stories explained things. Why does the sun rise and set? Because Utu travels across the sky in his chariot. Why do floods come? Because Enlil commands the storm. Why do we plant barley in the autumn? Because this is when the gods decreed planting should occur. Everything has a divine explanation, a mythological framework. But the stories also entertained. They were funny sometimes, bawdy, irreverent, gods getting drunk, gods playing tricks on each other, gods seducing mortals, gods behaving badly and facing consequences. This isn't solemn, dusty theology. This is vibrant storytelling, filled with personality and conflict and drama. Enki appears in many of these stories, always scheming, always clever. In one myth, he gets drunk and gives away the me, the divine decrees that govern civilization, to the goddess Inanna. She tricks him while he's intoxicated, loads the decrees onto her boat, and sails away. When Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done, he tries to get them back, but Inanna has already reached her city of Uruk. Too late. It's a funny story. But it also says something serious. The ME, the principles of civilization, can be transferred. Cities compete for them. And sometimes, divine authority is less important than divine cunning. Enki loses this round, but he's not diminished. If anything, the story makes him more sympathetic, more human in his flaws. Perhaps that's why Enki endured, why his stories were copied and recopied, told and retold, for thousands of years. He's relatable, he makes mistakes, he has appetites, he cares about things, including humanity, in ways that the more distant, more authoritarian gods don't. The gods aren't eternal, not really. They're born from human need, human imagination, human attempts to make sense of a world that often makes no sense. They evolve as the culture evolves, and when the culture changes enough, when new peoples arrive with new ideas, the gods transform, merge, fade, are forgotten. But for now, in the rising cities of Sumer, in the temples growing larger with each generation, the gods are vivid, real, present. They dwell in the temple sanctuaries, they receive offerings, they communicate through dreams and omens and the words of priests. They shape human destiny, and among them, dwelling in the waters beneath the earth, possessing wisdom and cunning and compassion for the clay creatures he helped create, is Enki, waiting for the moment when he'll defy divine law to save humanity from flood. The stage is set, the actors are in place, and the story, ancient when writing captured it, old beyond measuring, is about to begin. When the first European archaeologists arrived in Mesopotamia in the mid-19th century, they were treasure hunters more than scientists. They dug with shovels and speed, looking for museum pieces, for impressive sculptures and inscriptions that would fill galleries in London and Paris, and Berlin. The careful stratigraphic excavation we practice today, the patient recording of every artefact's position, the slow brushwork revealing contexts, none of that existed yet. But even digging carelessly, even hauling away cartloads of broken pottery they considered worthless, they found something extraordinary. Clay tablets, thousands of them, tens of thousands, small rectangular pieces of baked clay, covered with strange wedge-shaped marks, pressed into the surface when the clay was still wet. At first, no one could read them. The script was called cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus meaning wedge. But the language was unknown, the sounds were lost. These tablets might have been accounting records or sacred hymns or shopping lists, and there was no way to tell. They sat in museum storerooms, mute witnesses to a civilization that had fallen silent 3,000 years before Christ. The breakthrough came slowly, painfully. A British officer named Henry, Rawlinson spent years in the 1830s and 40s copying a massive inscription carved into a cliff face at Behistun in Persia. The inscription was in 3 languages, including Old Persian, which scholars were beginning to understand. By comparing the parallel texts, Rawlinson and others gradually cracked the code. Cuneiform could be read, but that was just the beginning. Old Persian was one thing, Akkadian was another, and beneath Akkadian, older still, was Sumerian, a language unrelated to any other known tongue, a linguistic isolate, no descendants, no cousins, just this ancient language spoken in southern Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, preserved only in clay. George Smith changed everything. He was a banknote engraver in London, self-taught in Assyriology, hired by the British Museum to sort and translate tablets. In 1872, while working through fragments from Nineveh, he found something that stopped him cold, a flood story, a narrative about a great deluge sent. By the gods! About one righteous man warned to build a boat, about animals brought aboard 2 by 2, about a dove sent to find dry land. The parallels to the biblical Noah story were obvious, undeniable. But this tablet predated the composition of Genesis by at least 1,000 years, maybe 2,000. This was the older version, the original, or closer to it. The story that had travelled through time and cultures, changing in details but preserving the essential narrative. Smith was so excited he reportedly began tearing off his clothes in the museum workroom. That's probably apocryphal. But his discovery made headlines. The Daily Telegraph funded an expedition for him to find more fragments of the tablet, and he did, though he died of dysentery in Aleppo on his way back. He was 36, but his work opened doors that would never close. More excavations followed, proper excavations. Leonard Woolley at in the 1920s and 30s, digging with care, revealing not just palaces but houses, not just temples but workshops. The University of Pennsylvania and the British Museum jointly sponsored digs at Nippur, the religious centre of Sumer, where thousands more tablets emerged from the temple archives. And among all these texts, appearing again and again, was Enki, sometimes written as Ea in Akkadian texts, but recognisably the same deity. The god of the Abzu, the god of wisdom, the crafts god, the trickster, the saviour. The tablets preserve hymns praising him. Enki, king of the Abzu, the great prince of the earth, whose word is reliable, who speaks with authority, whose command is unchanging. But also stories showing him drunk, lustful, scheming, the reverence and the irreverence side by side. One particular myth appears in several versions, the Atrahasis epic, named for its human hero. It's older than the biblical flood narrative, much older. The earliest fragments date to around 1800 BCE, but the story itself is clearly more ancient. Scholars believe it was composed during the Old Babylonian period, perhaps around 1900-1700 BCE, but drawing on Sumerian traditions that go back another 1,000 years. The story goes like this. The gods created humans to do the work the lesser gods had grown tired of, digging irrigation canals, building temples, growing food. For centuries, humanity laboured for the gods, but humans multiplied, became noisy. Enlil, the king of gods, couldn't sleep for all the racket humanity made, so Enlil decided to wipe them out, first with plague, then with drought, then with famine. Each time, Enki intervened, teaching humans how to appease the gods, how to survive. Enlil grew frustrated. Finally, he decreed a flood, a deluge that would destroy all life, and he bound the other gods with an oath not to warn humanity. But Enki found a loophole. He couldn't speak to humans directly. That was forbidden. So he spoke to a reed wall, to the wall of Atrahasis' house. Reed wall, Atrahasis, pay attention to my words. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, save your life. The boat you build, let it be equal in length and width. Atrahasis heard, built the boat, loaded it with animals and grain and his family. The flood came, 7 days and nights. The gods themselves were terrified by what they'd unleashed. When it ended, when the boat grounded on a mountain, when Atrahasis made offerings, the gods gathered around the smoke like flies. They were hungry. The humans who'd been feeding them with sacrifices were gone. Enlil was furious when he saw survivors, but Enki defended his actions. How could you bring about this flood without thinking? Punish the wrongdoer for his wrongdoing, but don't destroy everyone. The gods agreed. Humanity was allowed to continue, though birth and death were introduced to keep the population manageable. This story, pressed into clay tablets that were then baked hard, as stone, survived for 4,000 years, buried in temple ruins, forgotten, silent, until archaeologists with brushes and patience brought them back into light. If you could hold one of these tablets, and museums display them, you'd feel the clay's texture, smooth in places, rough where it cracked or chipped, cool to the touch. The wedge marks are tiny, precise, made with a reed stylus cut at an angle. Each sign is a cluster of wedges, horizontal and vertical, representing syllables or whole words. The tablets are small, many fit in your palm, but they contain universes, stories and laws and business transactions and astronomical observations. the entire intellectual output of a civilization, preserved in the most fragile and most durable medium imaginable. Fragile because clay can shatter, durable because, once fired, it lasts essentially forever. More tablets are still being translated. Museums and universities hold collections numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Most are economic texts, boring lists of grain deliveries and sheep counts, but among them, literary gems still wait. New versions of known stories, unknown myths, perspectives we haven't encountered yet, and every translation refines our understanding. Every new fragment adds details. We learn that Enki had a wife, Ninhursag or Damgal Nuna depending on the text, that his sacred number was 40, that his symbol was a goatfish, a creature that's half goat, half fish, representing his dual nature as god of both land and water. We learn that his city, Eridu, was considered the first city ever built. That kingship descended there from heaven before spreading to other cities. That Enki's temple, the Abzu, the house of the cosmic ocean, was rebuilt at least 18 times over thousands of years, each generation raising the sacred structure on the ruins of the one before. The tablets speak, slowly, in a dead language deciphered by patient scholars. But they speak. They tell us about a god who loved humanity, who broke rules to save us, who whispered through walls because he couldn't speak directly, who valued cleverness over authority, creativity over obedience. And they raise questions. Why did this story matter so much to the Sumerians and Babylonians? What historical event, if any, lies behind the flood narrative? How did these Mesopotamian myths influence later traditions, biblical and otherwise? The clay holds some answers, but like all answers, they lead to deeper questions, to mysteries that writing can preserve but not fully solve. The tablets wait in their museum cases, patient as the clay they're made from, still speaking to anyone willing to listen, to learn the language, to hear what the ancient voices pressed into wet clay 5,000 years ago and more. Who was Enki, really? Not the historical figure, because gods aren't historical in that sense, but the concept, the personality, the role he played in Sumerian imagination and religion. Start with his domain, the Abzu. This word appears constantly in texts about Enki. It's usually translated as the deep, or the abyss, or the cosmic ocean. But it's more specific than that. It's fresh water, the underground aquifer, the source of all springs and wells and rivers. The Sumerians understood their geography intimately. They knew that fresh water came from below. When you dug a well, you reached water. The deeper you dug, the more reliable the water. Therefore, beneath the earth, there must be a vast ocean, an endless supply of fresh water from which all surface water originates. This wasn't wrong. Exactly. There are aquifers beneath Mesopotamia, underground water tables that wells tap into. The Sumerians' observation was accurate. Their explanation, that it was a cosmic ocean dwelling place of a god, that was mythological. But the observation itself was sound. Enki dwelled in the Abzu. His palace was there, beneath the earth, in the watery depths. When artists depicted him, they often showed water flowing from his shoulders, twin streams, representing the Tigris and Euphrates, flowing from the god himself. He was the water, or the water was him. The distinction blurred. But he wasn't just a water god. He was the god of wisdom, of knowledge, of magic and incantations, of crafts and arts. Why? Why would a water deity also govern these domains? Perhaps because water itself is mysterious. You can't hold it, can't grasp it. It slips through your fingers. It takes any shape, fills any container, flows round obstacles. It's adaptable, clever in a sense, and in a desert climate, in a land where water means life, understanding water, controlling it through irrigation, that's the highest form of wisdom. Or perhaps because depths hide secrets. What lies beneath the surface can't be seen, must be intuited, guessed at, discovered through exploration. Enki dwells in hidden places, in the unseen realm, in the source from which knowledge bubbles up like spring water. The texts give Enki credit for organising the world. After creation, after the cosmos emerged from primordial chaos, Someone had to assign roles, decide which god governed which river, which deity managed the flocks, who controlled rain, grain, beer, music. This was Enki's work. He distributed the ME, those divine decrees we mentioned, giving each god their office, each craft its divine patron. This is cosmic bureaucracy, but it's also profound theology. Order doesn't just happen, it must be imposed. Chaos is the natural state. Order requires intelligence, planning, organisation. And that's Enki's domain. Not brute force, but clever arrangement. Making the pieces fit, finding the right place for everything. He was also, and this is crucial, a creator god. Several myths credit him with creating humanity. The method varies. In one version, he shapes people, from clay, mixing it with the blood of a slain god. The divine blood gives humans intelligence, consciousness. The clay gives us mortality, connection to earth. In another version, he and the mother goddess Ninhursag work together. She provides the womb, he provides the knowledge. They create humans like a craftsman creates pottery, carefully, deliberately, with purpose. And the purpose, according to most versions, is labour. Humans exist to serve the gods, to grow food and build temples and perform rituals. This sounds harsh to modern ears, but it's how the Sumerians understood their relationship to the divine. Service, not worship in the abstract, but practical service, feeding the gods through sacrifice, housing them in temples, maintaining their cults. Yet despite creating humans as servants, Enki develops affection for them. This is unusual. Most gods in Mesopotamian mythology are distant, unconcerned with individual human welfare. They demand service, but don't particularly care about the servants. Enlil is the classic example. Humans are noisy, bothersome, expendable, but Enki is different. He teaches humans, he gives them gifts, writing so they can keep records, mathematics so they can calculate and plan, metalworking so they can make better tools, brewing so they can make beer, agriculture so they can feed themselves, magic so they can protect themselves from evil spirits. These gifts aren't required. Enki doesn't have to teach humanity anything, but he does. Perhaps because he's proud of his creations, perhaps because he's generous, perhaps because, as a trickster god, he enjoys upsetting the divine order, empowering those who should be powerless. The trickster aspect is important. Enki appears in many myths as someone who bends rules, finds loopholes, achieves goals through cleverness rather than force. He's not rebellious in an aggressive sense. He doesn't challenge Enlil's authority directly, but he subverts it, works around it, achieves his ends through misdirection and cunning. In one myth, the goddess Inanna visits Enki's underwater palace. He greets her with a feast. They drink beer together, a lot of beer, and while drunk, Enki gives her the me, those divine decrees, all of them. Kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, the art of lovemaking, everything. When he sobers up, he realizes his mistake. He sends servants to get the Emmy back, but Inanna has already loaded them onto her boat and sailed to her city of Uruk. She wins, Enki loses, and he accepts it. He doesn't destroy Uruk or punish Inanna. He's embarrassed, but he honours what happened. The Emmy are gone, Uruk becomes great, and Enki, well, he probably has another beer. This is not how gods usually behave in ancient Near Eastern mythology. Usually, divine word is law, unchangeable, absolute. But Enki makes mistakes, gets drunk, gets outsmarted, and the myths don't punish him. For this, if anything, they celebrate it. He's more interesting because he's flawed. His sexuality is also prominent. He sleeps with various goddesses, sometimes his own granddaughters, which sounds shocking now but was part of the mythological framework. These unions often produce important deities or establish divine relationships, but they also show Enki as someone driven by desire, by appetite, by the same urges that drive humans. Perhaps that's why he sympathizes with humanity. He understands desire, understands making mistakes, understands the gap between what you intend and what you actually do. He's not a distant, perfect deity. He's complicated, messy, real in ways that purely transcendent gods are not. When the flood comes, when Enlil decrees humanity's destruction, Enki's response is in character. He can't directly defy the king of gods. That would be rebellion. But he can find a loophole. He can speak to a wall instead of to a person. He can save one family, preserve the seed of humanity, ensure that his creations survive. It's clever. It's compassionate. It's exactly what you'd expect from the god who dwells in water, whose element slips through fingers, who represents the creative intelligence that finds solutions to impossible problems. The Sumerians sculpted him in stone sometimes, usually seated, water flowing from his shoulders, often holding a vase, water pouring from it, sometimes surrounded by fish, symbols of his aquatic domain. The sculptures show a bearded god, dignified but not stern, wise but not distant, powerful but accessible. These images were placed in temples. Worshippers would stand before them, make offerings, speak prayers. What did they ask for? Probably wisdom, since that was Enki's gift. Probably help with irrigation, since water was his domain. Probably protection, since he'd protected humanity once and might do so again. We don't have recordings of those prayers. The spoken words are lost. But we can imagine them. Enki, Lord of the depths, give me understanding. Help me solve this problem. Bless my fields with water. Teach me your crafts. Simple requests, human requests, to a god who, uniquely among the pantheon, seemed to care about humans answering. The god in the water, the wise one, the clever one, the compassionate one, the one who whispered through walls, the one who saved what he had made. We'll meet him again in the most famous story, the flood narrative, the moment when his cleverness and compassion combined to preserve humanity against the will of heaven. But first, we need to visit his city, the place where he was most honoured, where his temple stood for thousands of years, where the very ground was considered sacred, blessed by the god's presence. Eridu, the first city, or so the Sumerians believed, the place where everything began. In the Sumerian king list, an ancient document cataloguing all the rulers of Mesopotamia from the beginning of time, the first line reads, "When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not Ur, not Uruk, not any of the great cities that would later dominate Sumerian civilization. Eridu, a relatively small city in southern Mesopotamia, near the shore of the Persian Gulf as it existed 5,000 years ago. This was where it all began, or so the tradition claimed. Modern archaeology has complicated and confirmed this claim in interesting ways. Eridu was indeed one of the earliest permanent settlements in Mesopotamia. Pottery found there dates to the Ubaid period, around 5400 BCE. That makes it roughly contemporary with other early sites. Not uniquely first, but among the earliest. But what makes Eridu special isn't when people first settled there. It's what they built and kept rebuilding, and rebuilding again, for thousands of years. At the centre of Eridu stood a temple, the Iabzu, the house of the cosmic ocean, Enki's dwelling place on Earth. Archaeologists, excavating in the 1940s and 50s, discovered something remarkable beneath this temple. A sequence of earlier temples, not one or two, but 18. 18 successive structures, each built directly on top of the previous one, each raising the sacred space higher, each generation adding to the accumulated holiness. The earliest temple, level associated at the bottom, dates to around 5000 BCE. It's tiny. A single room, maybe 3 meters by 4, mud brick walls, a simple altar, nothing grand, but positioned exactly where every subsequent temple would be built. Level 16th added more rooms, level 16 grew larger still, and so on, up through the centuries, each generation tearing down the old temple when it decayed, but building the new one on the exact same spot, maintaining continuity, keeping the sacred centre fixed. This is extraordinary. This is devotion maintained across thousands of years. The people building level V around 4000 BCE had no memory of the people who built level V Steet 1,000 years earlier, but they honoured the same god in the same place, continuing a tradition so old it seemed eternal. Picture the construction of one of these temples, maybe around 3500 BCE, level 8, let's say. The old temple has stood for generations, but now the walls are crumbling. The roof sags, the bricks, made from mud and straw, are dissolving back into the earth they came from. It's time to rebuild. The priests organize the work. The community provides labor. Men make bricks, tens of thousands of them. Mud from the riverbanks mixed with chopped straw, packed into wooden molds, dried in the sun until hard enough to stack. Women carry water, prepare food for the workers. Children run errands, learn by watching. The old temple is carefully dismantled. The sacred objects inside, the cult statue of Enki, the offering vessels, the ritual implements, these are moved to temporary shelter. The walls come down, the rubble is spread, to create a platform. The new temple will be higher, closer to heaven, closer to the gods. New walls rise, thicker than before, better made. The craftsmen have learned techniques their grandfathers didn't know. The bricks fit tighter, the mortar, mud mixed with crushed reeds, bonds stronger. The walls are plastered smooth, then painted white. In the Mesopotamian sun, a white building glows, visible for miles, announcing sacred presence. Inside, rooms for different purposes. The main sanctuary where Enki's statue will sit. Storage rooms for offerings. Kitchens where sacrificial meals are prepared. Quarters for priests who maintain the cult. Everything organized. Everything planned. Everything serving the gods' needs. When the temple is finished, there's a dedication ceremony. We don't know exactly what happened, but we can imagine. Processions, prayers, sacrifices. The statue of Enki carried in state from its temporary home to the new sanctuary, placed on its pedestal, anointed with oil, dressed in fine robes, given offerings of fish and bread and beer. And then, for the next few centuries, this temple is the centre of Eridu's life, the centre of the cosmos, in a sense. Because the temple isn't just a building, it's the point where heaven and earth connect, where divine and human realms touch, where Enki, dwelling in the Abzu beneath, rises to receive worship from his clay creations above. The priests maintain daily rituals, morning offerings, evening prayers, seasonal festivals. On certain days, the whole community participates. Feasts, celebrations, moments when the barrier between human and divine feels thin, permeable, almost crossable. Excavations at Eridu have found fish bones in great quantities. This makes sense. Enki is a water god. Fish are his creatures. Offering fish to him honours his domain, acknowledges his power over the waters that sustain life. The priests probably caught the fish themselves, or accepted them from fishermen who brought them as offerings. Large fish for important occasions, smaller ones for daily ritual. Beer was also offered. We know this because beer vats have been found near the temple, large ceramic vessels where grain was fermented. Beer was sacred in Mesopotamia, Inanna's gift, but also Enki's domain since he taught humans brewing. Pouring beer in libation, watching it soak into the earth, reaching down to the Abzu where Enki dwells. This connected worshippers to their god. The temple grew wealthy. People donated offerings, not just perishable food, but valuable goods, gold, silver, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, trade goods that demonstrated Eridu's connections, its importance in regional networks. The priests managed these resources, redistributing some, storing some, using them to maintain the cult. But Eridu never became a major political centre. Other cities, Uranoruk especially, grew larger, more powerful. They had stronger kings, bigger armies, more control over trade routes. Eridu remained important religiously, but politically it was a backwater. Perhaps that's appropriate. Enki wasn't a god of kings and conquest. He was a god of wisdom, of craft, of the clever solution rather than the violent one. A city dedicated to him might naturally focus on temple rather than palace, on ritual rather than war. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, around 2000 BCE, Eridu was declining. The Persian Gulf's shoreline had receded. The city was no longer coastal. Trade shifted to other ports. Population dwindled. The temple was maintained, but barely. The great sequence of rebuilding had ended. Level 1, the final temple, stood for centuries without replacement. Eventually, even that was abandoned. The priests left. The offerings stopped. The temple slowly crumbled. Sand drifted in. Silence settled over the site. For thousands of years. until archaeologists with shovels and curiosity arrived to uncover what had been lost. Today, Eridu is a tell, an artificial hill created by millennia of human occupation. Each generation's structures built on the previous generation's ruins. The site is in Iraq, in a remote area difficult to reach. The temples have been partially excavated, then reburied to protect them from looters and erosion. But the 18 levels remain, testimony to thousands of years of continuous worship, to devotion that outlasted empires, to a god who mattered so much that people kept building, kept offering, kept praying, generation after generation, century after century. Enki's temple, the first temple, the house of the cosmic ocean, where fresh water was honoured, where wisdom was sought, where humanity came to speak with the God who had shaped them from clay and loved them enough to save them. The ruins rest in silence now, but once they hummed with prayer and offering and the smoke of sacrifice rising toward heaven. Once they were the centre of the world, where earth met water met sky, where human met divine, where Enki dwelled, patient as the depths, wise as the waters that flow forever beneath the earth. The city is gone, but the memory remains, pressed into clay, buried in tells, waiting for those who know where to dig, what to ask, how to listen to silence and hear the whisper of ancient voices speaking across impossible gulfs of time. At the height of Sumerian civilization, roughly 3000 to 2000 BCE, Enki's influence touched every aspect of life, not through force, not through commandment, but through gifts, through knowledge, through the divine decrees called Mi that governed how the world functioned. The Emi are difficult to translate. They're not laws, exactly, not magical spells, though they have magical power. They're more like cosmic principles, divine ordinances, the fundamental patterns that allow civilization to exist, and Enki possessed them, guarded them, distributed them according to his wisdom. There were dozens of Emi, perhaps over 100, though the exact count varies in different texts. Kingship was a Emi, so was priesthood. Truth and falsehood were Emi, descending into the underworld, ascending from it. The craft of the metalworker, the art of the scribe, sexual intercourse, prostitution, music, war. Everything that made human culture possible had its divine decree, its cosmic principle that Enki maintained. Imagine standing in a Sumerian city around 2500 BCE, maybe Uruk, the largest city in the world at that time, maybe 60,000 people living within its walls and in the surrounding fields. You can see Enki's gifts everywhere you look. The city walls themselves are baked brick, not sun-dried mud brick like earlier structures, but fired in kilns until hard as stone. This technology, the ability to fire clay at high temperatures, this is Enki's gift. The god who shaped humans from clay also taught them to transform clay into permanent material. Pottery, bricks, tablets. Writing is everywhere. On tablets carried by scribes, on stone monuments proclaiming royal achievements, on clay tags marking stored goods in temple warehouses. Cuneiform, those wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay. This is Enki's gift too. The god of wisdom gave humans the ability to capture speech in visible form, to preserve knowledge beyond the limits of memory. The scribes are a privileged class. Boys, usually, though some evidence suggests women could write too. Boys selected for training spend years learning the complex system. There are hundreds of signs to memorize. Each sign can represent a sound or a whole word or an idea. Each must be written precisely, the correct number of wedges, the correct angle, the correct pressure. The scribe schools are attached to temples. Young students copy standard texts, over and over, Sumerian proverbs, mathematical tables, hymns to the gods. The repetition trains hand and mind together. By the time a scribe completes training, he can write fluently, calculate complex problems, compose in multiple languages. And what do they write? Everything. Business contracts, letters, legal documents, mathematical astronomy tracking planetary movements, medical texts diagnosing illness and prescribing treatment, literature, myths and hymns and lamentations. The entirety of human knowledge, captured in clay, preserved for the future. Enki appears in some of these texts as the patron of scribes. Enki, Lord of Wisdom, who perfected the priestly offices, who gave the noble sceptre, who made complete the divine decrees. The scribes honour him, pray to him before beginning important work, acknowledge that their craft comes from divine gift, not human invention. Metalworking is another of Enki's gifts, the ability to take rocks, heat them until metal flows out, then shape that metal into tools and weapons and ornaments. This seems like magic. Rocks becoming liquid, liquid becoming solid again as something entirely different. The transformation requires fire, precise knowledge, divine favour. The metalworkers have their own god technically, Ninkura, or one of the craft deities, but Enki is acknowledged as the source, the one who first organised the crafts, who assigned each its divine overseer, who made it possible for humans to work copper, then bronze, then eventually iron. Watch a bronze smith at work in his workshop, the furnace glowing red, the heat intense even from a distance. He's making a blade, perhaps for a ceremonial dagger. The bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, melts in a clay crucible. When it reaches the right temperature, he pours carefully into a mould. The liquid metal hisses and steams. Gradually it cools, solidifies. He breaks away the mould, grinds and polishes the rough casting, sharpens the edge, attaches a handle of wood or bone. The finished blade is beautiful, deadly, valuable. It will be traded far from where it was made, carrying Sumerian craftsmanship to distant lands, demonstrating that civilization's gifts spread, flow like water, reach places far from their source. Brewing is sacred too. Beer was a staple in Mesopotamia, not a luxury, but daily food, liquid bread, rich in calories and nutrients, safer to drink than water from questionable sources. Almost everyone drank beer, men and women, adults and children. The only question was strength. The brewers were usually women. The goddess Ninkasi presided over brewing, but Enki had taught the technique. Tablets preserve hymns to Ninkasi that are actually brewing recipes in poetic form. You are the one who handles the dough with a big shovel, mixing in a pit the bapir with sweet aromatics. You are the one who bakes the bapir in the big oven, puts in order the piles of hulled grains. The process takes days. Barley is sprouted, dried, ground, mixed, with water and dates, allowed to ferment. The result is thick, grainy, nutritious, drunk through straws to filter out the sediment, shared in taverns and at feasts, given as wages, offered to the gods. Irrigation is perhaps Enki's greatest gift, the technology that makes Mesopotamian civilization possible. Without artificial watering, the hot, dry summers would kill crops. The unpredictable floods would destroy them, but with carefully designed canal systems, water can be controlled, directed, stored for when it's needed. The canal networks are extensive, main channels branching into secondary channels, those into smaller ditches reaching individual fields. Gates and dams regulate flow. In some places, water wheels lift it to higher ground. The system requires constant maintenance. Silt accumulates, walls erode. Cooperation between cities and regions is essential. Managing water is political as much as technical. Cities upstream can divert flow, leaving downstream areas dry. Disputes over water rights spark conflicts. Treaties allocate shares. Priests invoke divine authority to enforce agreements. Because water, Enki's domain, is too important for human authority alone. The god who dwells in the Abzu, who sends fresh water bubbling up from springs, who fills rivers from underground sources, he must be honoured, respected, appeased when necessary. Irrigation works because humans learned Enki's wisdom, but it continues because the god allows it. Also the Sumerians believed. Mathematics and astronomy also belong to Enki's sphere. The ability to count, to calculate, to predict celestial movements. These aren't just practical skills, they're sacred knowledge. Understanding the patterns of heaven reveals divine order, helps align human activity with cosmic rhythms. Sumerian mathematics is sophisticated, base 60 counting, which gives us 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours even today, multiplication tables, division algorithms, geometric formulas for calculating areas and volumes. Tablets preserve problems and solutions, showing that students struggled with word problems just like modern learners. The astronomers, usually priests, track stars and planets, note their positions, record their movements. Over centuries, patterns emerge. Planets follow predictable paths. Eclipses can be anticipated. This knowledge has practical value, determining calendar dates, timing religious festivals, but it also demonstrates that the cosmos is ordered, that chaos has been tamed, that Enki's organisation of the world holds firm. All these gifts, writing and metalworking and brewing and irrigation and mathematics, all flow from the god in the water, the clever one, the wise one, the one who didn't hoard knowledge but shared it, who empowered his clay creations to build something lasting. At civilization's height, in the great cities of Sumer and later Babylon, life depends on Enki's gifts. They're so integrated into daily existence that people probably don't think about divine origins constantly. They just write, just brew beer, just dig irrigation ditches. The sacred has become mundane through familiarity. But in the temples, the memory persists. The acknowledgement that everything humans know, everything that makes us civilized rather than merely surviving, came from beyond, from the depths, from the God who loved us enough to teach us, who organised chaos into cosmos so we could thrive. The me remain in Enki's keeping, the divine decrees that make the world function, and even when other gods, like Inanna, steal some of them, even when kingship shifts from one city to another, even when empires rise and fall, the fundamental patterns hold, because Enki maintains them, patient as water, wise as depths, eternal as the Abzu from which all fresh water flows. The Sumerians told several creation stories. None of them match. Different myths emphasize different aspects, different gods playing primary roles. This isn't contradiction. Exactly. It's multiplicity. Different traditions preserved side by side, each true in its own way, but in most versions, Enki plays a crucial role in creating humanity, sometimes as the primary creator, sometimes as assistant or advisor, but always present, always shaping the clay, providing the wisdom, making it possible for humans to exist. One version comes from the Atrahasis epic, that same text that preserves the flood narrative. The beginning of the story explains why humans were created at all, and it starts with divine labour. When the world was young, when the great gods had divided the cosmos among themselves, the lesser gods were assigned all the work. They dug the rivers, they cleared the canals, they hauled dirt and carried loads, back-breaking labour, endless labour. For 40 years, the text says, they worked without rest. Finally, they rebelled. The lesser gods threw down their tools. They burned their spades. They marched to Enlil's temple in the middle of the night, surrounding it, demanding relief. Enlil, king of the gods, didn't know what to do. He called the other great gods, Anu and Enki, to counsel. Enki, wise as always, proposed a solution. Let us create a substitute. Let us make a worker to bear the yoke. Let him carry the gods' labour. The assembly agreed. But how? How do you create a being that doesn't exist? Enki had the answer. One of the rebel gods, Geshtui, would be slaughtered, his blood mixed with clay. The divine essence, the intelligence and spirit, would come from the god's blood. The mortal substance, the temporary flesh, would come from earth. Imagine the scene. The divine assembly gathered, the victim chosen, perhaps willing, sacrificing himself so others could be free. The clay brought in, earth from the Abzu, from Enki's own domain, pure earth, primordial mud, the mother goddess, Nintu or Ninhursag, depending on the text, moulds the clay. Enki provides instruction, guidance, the creative intelligence that transforms raw material into living being. The divine blood is mixed in, the essence that makes humans more than mere clay. That gives us speech, thought, the ability to understand divine commands. 14 pieces of clay are shaped, 7 male, 7 female, placed in the divine womb for gestation. Time passes, and then birth. The first humans emerge, not from natural reproduction, but from divine craft, purpose-built, designed to serve. The gods rejoice. The lesser gods are freed from labour. The humans take over digging canals, building temples, growing food to offer in sacrifice. The divine order is restored. Everyone, divine and mortal, has their place. But Enki isn't finished. Creating humans was one thing. Making them functional is another. They need to be taught, shown how to live, given the tools and knowledge to fulfill their purpose. So Enki becomes teacher. He shows humans how to plant grain, how to bake bread, how to brew beer. He gives them the me, the divine decrees, or at least the ones humans need. Agriculture, architecture, writing eventually. All the civilizing arts flow from the God who created us. This isn't altruism. Exactly. Humans exist to serve the gods. But Enki takes the relationship seriously. He made us. We're his responsibility, his creations. And perhaps, over time, he develops affection, sees us as more than just tools, begins to value humanity for its own sake. Another creation myth gives a different version. In this one, Enki and the mother goddess get drunk at a feast. Playfully, they decide to create humans, but they're both intoxicated. The humans they make are flawed. Some blind, some lame, some unable to hold their urine. Each has a defect. When they sober up, they see what they've done. But instead of destroying the flawed creations, Enki finds a place for each. The blind become musicians, the lame become singers. Each defect is transformed into a role, a function. No one is useless. Everyone serves. This is a remarkable theological statement. It says that even what seems flawed, broken, imperfect, has divine purpose. That creation doesn't require perfection. That variety, including what we might judge as defect, is part of the divine plan. It also shows Enki as improviser, as someone who makes the best of mistakes, who finds solutions rather than abandoning failed attempts, who values his creations even when they don't turn out as intended. The clay itself is significant. Humans are made from earth, from mud, from the same material used to make bricks and pottery. We're literally shaped like vessels, formed and fired, temporary, fragile, subject to breaking and returning to dust. But we're also mixed with divine blood, with intelligence, with consciousness. We're hybrids, part earth, part heaven, part mortal, part bearing divine, spark. This duality defines human nature in Sumerian thought. We're not animals, but we're not gods either. We exist between, in the liminal space where earth meets sky. Enki understands this better than other gods, because he works in liminality. His domain is water, which is neither solid nor air. His nature is trickster, which operates in the space between order and chaos. He's perfect creator for in-between beings, for creatures that don't quite fit categories. After creating humanity, Enki gives us one more gift. He separates us into two groups. Those who live in civilization, in cities, practicing agriculture and crafts, and those who remain wild, nomadic, living outside the ordered world. Both are human, both are his creations, but they have different roles, different relationships to the divine order. The city dwellers serve the gods directly. They build temples, offer sacrifices, maintain the cults. They're the primary focus of divine attention. But the nomads serve too, in their own way. They bring resources from outside. They trade. They remind the civilized that wilderness still exists, that the ordered world is small, that chaos surrounds it still. This distinction would persist throughout Mesopotamian history, city versus steppe, civilized versus wild. But both groups trace their origin to the same source, to the god who shaped clay with knowing hands, who breathed intelligence into mud, who made it possible for humans, all humans, to exist. The Sumerians sometimes referred to themselves as the black-headed people. Black hair, perhaps, or perhaps a poetic term. But the phrase emphasizes common identity. We're Enki's creation, made from clay and divine blood, shaped to serve but given wisdom, temporary but touched by eternal. This origin story shaped how Sumerians understood themselves. They weren't accidents, weren't random. They existed for a purpose, divine purpose. That purpose was labor. Yes, service to the gods. But it was also more. It was participation in cosmic order. It was maintaining the balance between chaos and civilization. It was being the bridge between earth and heaven. And when flood came, when Enlil decided to destroy what had been made, Enki's response makes sense. He created humanity. He taught us. He shaped us and gave us our place in the cosmos. Of course he would save us. Of course he would find a way, through cleverness and compassion, to preserve what he had made. the creator saving his creation, the teacher protecting his students, the god who dwelled in water ensuring that the water, even in flood, would not destroy everything. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Before the flood, there's daily life to explore, rituals to observe, the ordinary sacred existence of people who knew they were shaped by divine hands, who lived in cities built on divine gifts, who looked up at stars and knew that order, fragile as it was, held firm for now, for this golden age, before everything changed. Let me tell you a story, one preserved in several versions across different tablets. A story that shows Enki at his most characteristic, clever and lusty and ultimately benevolent despite causing trouble. It's called Enki and Ninhursag, and it starts in a place called Dilmun. Dilmun is a paradise, a pure land, a place where there's no sickness, no death, no suffering, but there's also no fresh water. It's perfect, but sterile. Nothing grows. The goddess Ninhursag, Enki's partner in creating humanity, lives there. But she complains. The land is too pure, too empty. It needs water to bloom. Enki hears her complaint, and being god of fresh water, he provides. He causes water to well up from the earth. Springs appear, rivers flow, Dilmun transforms from barren paradise to fertile garden. Plants grow, flowers bloom. The land becomes beautiful in a new way, rich and productive rather than empty and perfect. Ninhursag is pleased. She begins planting. She grows 8 special plants, each with unique properties, each sacred in its own way. She tends them carefully, watching them grow, proud of what she's creating with the water Enki provided. But Enki is curious. What are these plants? What do they do? He calls his servant, a god named Isimud, who has 2 faces and can look both ways at once. Go see what Ninhursag is growing. Bring me one of each. Isimud does as commanded. He picks one of each plant, brings them to Enki. And Enki, without asking what they are, without understanding their properties, eats them, all 8, one after another, consuming what Ninhursag created without permission, without consideration. When Ninhursag discovers this, she's furious. These were her plants, her sacred creations, and Enki just ate them casually or like common food. She curses him. Until he dies, I shall not look upon him with the eye of life. And the curse works. Enki falls ill. 8 parts of his body begin to fail, one for each plant consumed. His jaw, his tooth, his mouth, his throat, arm, rib, side. He's dying. The god of life-giving water is dying from what he consumed. The other gods are distraught. If Enki dies, who will maintain the world's order? Who will govern the fresh water? Who will keep the ME? They beg Ninhursag to relent, but she's gone, hidden, refusing to look upon Enki. Finally, a fox appears, clever creature, trickster animal. It speaks to Enlil. If I bring Ninhursag back, will you reward me? Enlil agrees. The fox finds Ninhursag, somehow, through cunning, the texts don't explain, and convinces her to return. Ninhursag sees Enki dying. Her anger softens. After all, they're partners, co-creators of humanity. She may be angry, but she doesn't want him dead. So she asks, "What hurts you?" For each pain, each failing organ, she creates a healing deity. My jaw hurts. She births Abu. My tooth hurts. She births Nintulla. My rib hurts. She births Ninti, whose name means both Lady of the Rib and Lady of Life. 8 pains, 8 healing deities born to cure them. Enki is healed. The crisis passes, and presumably he's learned not to eat sacred plants without asking. It's a strange story, funny in places, serious in others. What does it mean? Perhaps it's about transgression and healing. Enki crosses a boundary, eats what he shouldn't, suffers consequences, but is ultimately forgiven and restored. The pattern of mistake and redemption, of weakness and recovery. Perhaps it's about male and female principles. Enki's impulsive consumption versus Ninhursag's creative cultivation. Destruction and creation. Death and life. The 2 forces that must work together despite tension between them. Perhaps it's about the origin of healing. The 8 deities born from Enki's pain become patrons of medicine. His suffering creates the cure for human suffering. His mortality, temporary as it is, makes possible remedies for our mortality. Or perhaps it's just a good story. Gods behaving badly, consequences following naturally, resolution coming through cooperation. The Sumerians didn't always need deep meanings. Sometimes a tale of divine mischief was enough. But this story is typical of Enki myths. He's not perfect. He makes mistakes, gets into trouble, needs rescue sometimes. But he's never punished harshly, never cast down. Other gods may be angry, but they still need him, still value him, still work with him. This is different from many mythological traditions. Usually, gods who transgress suffer terribly. They're bound to rocks with eagles eating their livers. They're cast into pits. They're destroyed. But Enki transgresses repeatedly and gets away with it. Why? Perhaps because his transgressions serve a purpose. When he steals the Emmy while drunk, Inanna gains them for Uruk, and Uruk becomes great. When he saves humanity from the flood, he violates Enlil's decree, but preserves the species that serves all gods, his trickster nature, his boundary crossing. These create positive outcomes even when the methods are questionable, perhaps also because he's too useful to punish severely. The world needs someone who can think creatively, who can find solutions to impossible problems, who can work in the spaces between rules. Strict adherence to divine law is important, but so is flexibility. Enki provides that. The Sumerians, living in a world where rules were necessary but also sometimes inadequate, where survival often required cleverness more than strength. They appreciated a god who embodied that pragmatism. Enki was their god, the one who understood that theory and practice don't always align, that doing what's right sometimes means bending what's proper. This made him accessible. Enlil was distant, terrible, awe-inspiring. You feared Enlil, but Enki you could talk to, pray to, hope that he'd understand your situation, your need to cut corners, your human imperfection. Because he was imperfect too, divine, yes, powerful, absolutely, but flawed in ways that made him relatable. His sexuality was part of this. He wasn't faithful to any single goddess. He had relationships with multiple deities, some incestuous by our standards, though divine kinship worked differently than human. These unions often produced important deities or established cosmic relationships, but they also showed Enki as driven by desire, by impulse, by the same urges that drive mortals. This could be scandalous. Some texts treat it that way, but mostly it's just acknowledged. This is who Enki is, god of wisdom. Yes, but also god of bodily fluids, of generation, of the creative force that mingles and produces new life. Water and semen share symbolism in Sumerian thought. Both flow from hidden sources, both bring fertility, both are Enki's domain. The trickster aspect connects to this. Tricksters in mythology are often sexually active, often transgressive. They cross boundaries because boundaries constrain. And creation, whether making humanity from clay or fathering deities or teaching civilizations arts, creation requires crossing from potential to actual, from chaos to order, from nothing into something. Enki operates in that liminal space, always, whether he's eating forbidden plants or sleeping with inappropriate goddesses or whispering through walls to save humanity. He's the god of in-between, of transformation, of the moment when one thing becomes another. The stories about him celebrate this. They don't moralize, don't condemn, they just tell. Enki did this, then this happened, then this. The consequences follow. Balance is restored, and life continues, complicated and messy and beautiful in its imperfection. Perhaps that's the deepest wisdom. Not that perfection is possible, but that imperfection can be productive, that mistakes can lead to growth, that the gods themselves, at least some of them, share our struggles with desire and duty, with impulse and wisdom, with being flawed creatures trying to do good in a complex world. Enki the trickster, Enki the wise, both aspects true, both necessary, both part of why his stories endured, why they were copied and told, why they still speak to us across gulfs of time and culture, because we recognize him, we see ourselves, trying to be clever when we should be obedient, trying to help even when forbidden, making mistakes, suffering consequences, finding forgiveness, starting again. The clay creatures looking up at the God who made them and seeing, not perfection, but a mirror. In the courtyard of the Iabzu temple at Eridu, on a spring morning around 2400 BCE, priests are preparing for the day's rituals. The sun hasn't risen yet, but already they're working. This is the morning offering, the daily feeding of the god, and it must be ready when the first light touches the temple's white walls. One priest, a young man in his first year of service, carries a large fish from the temple's pond. It's a carp, maybe 2 feet long, silver scales catching lamplight. He killed it just moments ago, ensuring freshness. The god's food must be perfect, unblemished, offered with full attention. Another priest, older, grizzled, tends the altar fire, adding wood, coaxing flames. The smoke rises straight in the still morning air, carrying prayers upward to where sky gods dwell. But this smoke will also descend, down into the earth, down to the Abzu where Enki waits. The fish is cleaned, gutted, scaled, washed in water drawn from the sacred well, water that comes from Enki's own domain. The flesh is cut into portions. Some will be roasted, some offered raw. The variety pleases the god, demonstrates care, shows that his servants understand his preferences. While the fish cooks, another priest prepares beer. Not ordinary beer, but the finest available, brewed from the temple's own barley, fermented in vessels reserved for sacred use, strained through clean cloth until mostly clear, mixed with dates for sweetness. This is drink worthy of a god. The beer is poured into a golden cup, an ancient cup, used for this purpose for generations. The metal gleams in the firelight. The liquid inside is dark, rich, fragrant. One of the priests, the eldest, tastes it first. This is his duty, to ensure quality, to protect the god from any imperfection. He nods. It's good. The sun touches the horizon. The moment has come. The priests process from the preparation area to the sanctuary. They move slowly, reverently, carrying the offerings. Fish on golden platters, beer in sacred vessels, bread baked in the temple ovens, dates, honey. Everything Enki might desire. Inside the sanctuary, in semi-darkness, stands the cult statue. It's not large, maybe 3 feet tall, wood covered with gold leaf, inlaid with lapis lazuli and carnelian. The god sits, enthroned. Water flows from his shoulders, carved streams that seem to move in the flickering lamplight. His face is serene, knowing, the face of wisdom looking out at his servants. The offerings are placed before the statue, on a low table, arranged carefully, aesthetically. The priests understand that presentation matters, that beauty honours the divine. They step back, wait, give the god time to consume the offering spiritually, though the physical food remains untouched. The high priest speaks, a prayer, or really a greeting. Enki, lord of the Abzu, prince of the earth, who dwells in the pure waters, accept these offerings from your servants. We give you fish from your waters, bread from grain you taught us to grow, beer brewed by your wisdom. Be pleased, look upon us with favour, maintain the springs, keep the rivers flowing, let the wells not run dry. The prayer is ancient, word for word the same as recited for centuries. Continuity matters, the exact phrases, properly pronounced, maintain connection across time. Link today's priests to those who served generations ago. Link the human temple to the divine realm. After appropriate time, the offerings are removed. The god has consumed their essence. Now the physical food can be distributed. Some goes to the priests as their portion, some to temple workers and servants, some to the poor who gather outside temple gates. Nothing is wasted. The god's bounty flows outward, feeding the community. This happens every day, every single day. Morning and evening offerings on festival days, or the offerings increase. Whole cattle might be sacrificed, dozens of fish, jars of beer and oil. The temple courtyard fills with people, not just priests, but ordinary citizens bringing their own offerings, creating abundance, demonstrating devotion. Imagine a festival celebrating the new year, the Akitu festival. though it's more associated with other gods in later periods. But Enki receives his share. The temple is cleaned, decorated with fresh reeds. The statue is brought out, carried in procession through the streets so citizens can see their god, can feel his presence. Musicians play, drums and lyres and flutes. The rhythms are ancient, passed down through temple schools. The melodies honour Enki specifically, different from music played for other deities. Each god has their songs, their particular modes and instruments. People sing, hymns praising Enki's wisdom, recounting his deeds, how he organised the world, how he taught humanity, how he saved us from flood. The stories are told through song, through performance, making them vivid and present. Not ancient history, but living memory. Dancing happens too. Ritual dancing. Priests trained in sacred movements, their steps prescribed, symbolic, representing cosmic patterns. The dance is prayer, the body becoming offering, movement as meditation. The dancers may enter trance states, feeling the gods' presence, becoming temporarily vessels for divine power. And throughout all of this, beer flows. Beer is sacred but also social. People drink together, share cups. The boundaries between human and divine soften. In intoxication, perhaps, the gods feel closer, more accessible, the distance of holiness temporarily bridged. Take a breath here, because this was religion in Sumer. Not abstract theology, not quiet contemplation in isolated prayer, but embodied practice, community celebration, sensory overload of music and smoke and food and drink and movement, religion that engaged the whole person, body and mind and spirit together. The priests maintained daily contact with the gods through offerings and ritual, but ordinary people participated too, brought their own offerings on special occasions, attended festivals, sought blessings for marriages, births, business ventures. The temple wasn't separate from life, it was the centre of life. Home worship happened too, small, shrines in houses, clay figurines of protective deities, regular prayers. But the temple was where divine power concentrated, where the god actually dwelt, in statue form, where cosmic and human realms touched. Enki's temples, the Iabzu at Eridu primarily, but also shrines in other cities, were places of learning too. Scribal schools attached to the temple taught writing and mathematics. Libraries preserved tablets containing ancient wisdom. Priests studied the movements of stars and planets, seeking to understand divine patterns in celestial motion. This knowledge was sacred, dangerous to share too freely, but also necessary. Someone had to maintain the calendar, calculate when to plant and harvest, determine auspicious dates for important undertakings, interpret omens, read the god's will in the flight of birds, in the patterns of oil on water, in the shapes of sheep livers. Enki, as god of wisdom, presided over all this. The priests studying in his temple were his students. The knowledge they acquired was his gift. Writing, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, all these flowed from the Abzu, from the depths where wisdom dwells, from the God who loves humanity enough to teach us. But not everyone could access this knowledge. Literacy was rare. Perhaps 1% of the population could read and write. The rest lived in an oral world. They knew stories, songs, traditions passed down verbally. They knew practical skills learned through apprenticeship. But the written wisdom, the tablets, those were priestly domain. This created hierarchy, inequality. The literate had power the illiterate lacked. But it also created stability, continuity. The knowledge preserved in tablets didn't die when old people died. It lasted, accumulated, built on itself. This is what allowed civilization to grow more complex over generations. And Enki, presiding over this process, was the god of that accumulation, of knowledge preserved, of wisdom transmitted, of humanity becoming more than it was through learning what had been discovered before. The offerings continued, daily, yearly, century after century, the fish and bread and beer flowing to the god, the prayers rising and descending, the connection maintained between human community and divine power that sustained it. This wouldn't last forever. Nothing does. The temples would eventually close. The offerings would cease. The statues would be broken or buried. The priests would die without successors. Silence would fall over sanctuaries that had hummed with ritual for 3,000 years. But that's still far in the future. For now, in Sumer's golden age, the religion lives. The gods dwell in their temples. Enki sits in the Iabzu, receiving offerings, blessing his people, maintaining the cosmic order he established when the world was young. The smoke rises, the prayers continue, and somewhere deep beneath the earth, in waters that feed all springs and rivers, the god of wisdom watches, listens, prepares, though he doesn't know it yet, for the moment when everything will be threatened, when he'll need all his cleverness to save what he's helped create. But first, hidden dimensions wait to be explored. Secret knowledge, cosmic connections, the deeper meanings encoded in water and wisdom and the god who dwells between worlds. Beneath the earth, beneath the fields and cities and temples, beneath everything visible and known, the Sumerians believed there lay an ocean, not salt water like the seas, fresh water, pure water, the source of all springs and rivers and wells, the Abzu. This wasn't metaphor. Not entirely. The Sumerians observed reality carefully. They dug wells and found water. The deeper they dug, the more reliable the water. Therefore, beneath the earth, water existed in vast quantities. Where did it come from? It had to have a source. And that source, that hidden realm, was the Abzu. Enki dwelled there, in those unseen depths. His palace existed underwater, in a realm no mortal could visit. The texts describe it as beautiful beyond imagination. Lapis lazuli walls, cedar beams, silver and gold fixtures, a place of abundance and wisdom, where the god sat in council with his own thoughts, where knowledge accumulated like sediment settling in still water. Perhaps the Abzu represents the unconscious, the hidden depth of mind where wisdom dwells beneath the surface of awareness. Jung might say so, the collective unconscious, the deep waters where archetypes swim like fish, where drawing up knowledge feels like pulling water from a well. You lower the bucket into darkness and raise it full of what you need. Or perhaps it's simpler. Water table exists. Underground aquifers are real. The Sumerians correctly observed that fresh water comes from below. They gave that geological fact a theological framework. The water has to live somewhere. Someone has to govern it. Enki, God. Of wisdom and craft and creative intelligence. That's who. The connection between water and wisdom appears across cultures. Living water, springs that bubble up unexpectedly, hidden sources that sustain life. There's something mysterious about water that way. It doesn't stay where you put it. It seeps, flows, finds channels, moves through stone. You can't grasp it, can't hold it, only guide it, temporarily, until it finds its own way. Enki is like that, ungrasped, flowing around obstacles, finding solutions through indirect paths. His wisdom isn't the wisdom of stone tablets and fixed law. It's fluid wisdom, adaptive, responsive, changing shape to fit the vessel while remaining essentially itself. The Abzu also represents the primordial, the source, the beginning before beginning. Many creation myths, Mesopotamian and otherwise, start with water, chaos waters, the deep. From that formless potential, order emerges. Gods separate sky from sea, land from water, but the water remains, beneath, before. The foundation that supports everything built on top. Enki dwelling in the Abzu means he's close to origins, to the raw material of creation. When he shapes humans from clay, he mixes it with water, his water, Abzu water. The primordial substance that was here before anything else. We're made from endings and beginnings, earth and water, mortality and the eternal source. Imagine descending into the Abzu. This is impossible. Obviously, mortals can't go there. But imagine it anyway. You pass through earth, through layers of soil and rock. The light fades, darkness envelops you, and then you break through into vast space. Underwater caverns stretching endlessly, illuminated somehow, perhaps by bioluminescent creatures, perhaps by the god's own radiance. Water everywhere, cool and clear. You can breathe it, because this is mythological space, dream space. The normal rules don't apply. You swim through corridors of lapis lazuli, past columns of silver. Schools of fish dart around you. Sacred fish, Enki's children. They don't flee, they accompany you, and there, seated on a throne of coral and pearl, is the god himself, bearded, wise-eyed, water flowing eternally from his shoulders. He looks at you, knows you. You're his creation, after all, shaped by his hands. Do you speak? Do you ask questions? Or do you just witness, absorb, understand without words? This is the mystical dimension, the hidden teaching. Not everyone could access it, but initiates, priests who spent years in study and meditation, perhaps they experienced something like this, perhaps in dreams or visions or trance states induced by fasting or rhythm or sacred substances. Perhaps they descended to the Abzu and received wisdom directly from the source. The tablets don't describe these experiences in detail. Mystery religions keep their secrets, but hints appear, references to those who know the mystery, to initiates of the pure Abzu, to rituals performed in darkness and silence. Something happened in Enki's temples beyond public ceremony. Some knowledge was transmitted that couldn't be written, could only be experienced. Water itself was used ritually. Purification rites involved washing. Baptism, though that word comes later. The idea that water cleanses not just physically but spiritually. That immersion in water, especially water drawn from deep wells, water connected to the Abzu, that such immersion could transform, remove pollution, restore purity, reconnect the worshipper to divine source. Perhaps this is why Enki was associated with magic, with incantations and spells. Magic in Mesopotamia wasn't separate from religion. It was applied religion, using divine power for practical purposes, healing sick children, protecting houses from demons, ensuring safe childbirth. All of this required knowing the right words, the right rituals, the right connections to divine power. And Enki knew all the words, all the rituals. He was the master magician. The texts credit him with creating magic itself, giving it to humanity as a gift. When demons threatened, you called on Enki. When evil spirits caused disease, you invoked his power. When curses needed breaking, you sought his wisdom. The spells were often water-based. Just as this water flows away, so may the sickness flow away. Just as this water cannot return to its source, so may the demon not return. The magic operated through sympathy, like affecting, like water's properties, its flowing, its inability to be held. These became metaphors that shaped reality when spoken with proper authority. But the deepest wisdom wasn't in spells, it was in understanding, the secrets hidden beneath the surface, the patterns that connect things, the way water and wisdom and life all flow from the same source, the recognition that what you see isn't all there is, that depths exist, that mystery surrounds us, that the Abzu is always there, beneath, waiting for those who know how to descend. Modern geology reveals that the Sumerians were more right than they knew. Aquifers do exist beneath Mesopotamia, vast underground water reserves, fossil water, some of it, older than human civilization, water that fell as rain thousands of years ago, percolated down through rock, accumulated in porous layers, waited in darkness and silence and stillness. When you drill deep enough, you hit that water, it rises, pure and cold, unchanged by surface pollution, as fresh as rain that fell before Eridu was built. The ancients couldn't drill that deep, but they understood the principle. Water beneath earth, fresh water, source water, Abzu water, and they gave it a guardian, a god who dwelled in those depths, who knew their secrets, who controlled their flow, who could be petitioned, honoured, asked to maintain the springs and wells that made life possible in an arid land. Enki in the Abzu, lord of the deep, keeper of hidden wisdom, god of what flows beneath the surface of things. The mysteries he guards aren't lost exactly. They're just hidden, still there, still accessible to those willing to descend, to seek, to draw up the bucket and see what emerges from the depths. The water flows on, patient, eternal, waiting in the darkness beneath our feet, holding secrets, holding life, holding the possibility of wisdom for those who know where to dig, how to ask, what to listen for in the silence of deep places, hidden in the oldest flood narratives, embedded in the epic of Atrahasis and the Eridugenesis, lies the moment that defines Enki, the moment when wisdom and compassion meet divine law, and wisdom chooses compassion. The gods have decided humanity must be destroyed. The noise is too great, the population too large. Enlil, king of the gods, has decreed flood, a deluge that will wash away every living thing. Return the world to the watery chaos it came from. Start over, perhaps? Or just embrace the silence? The divine council agrees. Even Enki doesn't openly object. How could he? Enlil's word is law. The assembly has spoken, and besides, the gods bind themselves with an oath. None of them will warn humanity. None will speak the secret of what's coming. The flood will come without warning. Complete surprise. Total destruction. But Enki made humanity. Shaped us from clay and divine blood. Taught us to write and brew and build and think. We're his creation, his responsibility, his students, in a sense. And he can't bear to see us destroyed. Can't accept that the noise which annoys Enlil is reason enough to end millions of lives. Can't agree that creation should be so easily unmade. So he looks for a loophole, as tricksters do, as gods of wisdom must. The oath forbids him from warning humans directly. He cannot speak to a person and say, "Build a boat, save yourself." That's forbidden. But perhaps there's another way. Imagine Enki in his underwater palace, troubled, thinking. The flood is coming. The decision is made. But there must be a way. Water always finds a way, flows around obstacles, seeps through cracks, and he's the god of water, of finding solutions, of creative intelligence applied to impossible problems. And then he understands. He can't speak to a human, but he can speak to something else, something that will pass the message along, not directly violating the oath, but accomplishing the same goal through indirection. He chooses Atrahasis, or Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, Utanapishtim in later Akkadian texts. The name changes, but the role remains. The righteous man, the one who serves the gods faithfully, who lives well, who deserves saving even if the rest of humanity doesn't. Atrahasis lives in Shurpak, a city in southern Mesopotamia. His house is made of reeds and mud brick, walls woven from marsh reeds then plastered. Common construction. The walls are thin, sound, carries through them. This is important. One night, Atrahasis lies sleeping. Enki comes, not visibly, not in a way that would violate the oath, but his presence arrives, his voice, his divine whisper, and he doesn't speak to the man, he speaks to the wall. Wall, wall, reed wall. Pay attention to my words. The wall hears. How can it not? It's the God speaking. Divine voice carries authority over all creation, even woven reeds and dried mud. Atrahasis, tear down your house, build a boat, abandon possessions, save your life, reject wealth, keep your soul alive, bring aboard the seed of all living things. And then, specific instructions, dimensions for the boat. Let it be equal in length and width. Roof it like the Abzu, covering it over completely. Materials needed. Pitch it inside and outside so water cannot enter. What to bring? All the animals, all the birds, creatures of every kind. The wall doesn't relay the message, walls don't speak, but Atrahasis, lying there, hears it anyway. How can he not? The god is speaking to the wall. The man is right there. The sound passes through the reeds. What the wall hears, the man hears. Enki hasn't spoken to a human. He's spoken to a wall. The oath technically holds. This is the trickster's wisdom. The letter of the law upheld while the spirit is violated. The clever solution that achieves the goal without direct defiance. Enki can stand before the divine assembly and truthfully say, "I didn't warn humanity." He warned a wall. What the wall did with that information? Well, walls can't help if they leak. Atrahasis understands. He wakes, thinks, believes. This is the god of wisdom speaking, the one who taught humanity everything we know. If he says build a boat, you build a boat, even if it makes no sense, even if no flood is coming that you know of, even if your neighbours will think you mad. So Atreides begins, takes apart his house, just as commanded, uses the reeds and wood for the boat's frame, works day and night. His family helps, his neighbours watch, ask questions. Why are you building a boat in the desert? He can't explain, doesn't fully understand himself, just knows that Enki spoke and he must obey. The boat takes shape, vast, cube-shaped, apparently, equal in length and width and height, not a practical sailing vessel, more like a floating box. But it's not meant to sail, just to float, to survive, to preserve what's inside when everything else drowns. He brings animals, the text isn't clear on details, 2 of each kind, enough to repopulate, we don't know, but creatures are loaded aboard, wild and tame, paired presumably, male and female, the seed of all living things, as commanded. He brings grain, beer, oil, everything needed to survive for how long? He doesn't know, as long as it takes, as long as the flood lasts, and then the storm comes, the divine decision is executed. Enlil opens the heavens, rain falls, not normal rain, torrential, unceasing. The rivers overflow, the canals break, the marshlands vanish beneath rising water, cities flood, fields drown, people run for high ground but there isn't any. The land is flat, nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The tablet describes it vividly. The flood came like a battle upon the people. One person could not see another. They could not recognize each other in the catastrophe. The deluge bellowed like a bull. The wind shrieked like an eagle. Even the gods are terrified. They watch from heaven, see what they've unleashed and fear it. The gods were frightened by the deluge. They fled. They went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs, crouched against the outer wall. 7 days and nights. The flood continues. Everything drowns. Everything dies. The noise that annoyed Enlil, silenced. Forever. The world returned to watery chaos, the creation unmade, but Atreides' boat floats, rides the flood, preserved by pitch inside and out, by Enki's wisdom, by divine compassion working through loopholes. Finally, the rain stops. The water recedes. The boat grounds on a mountain. Atreides opens a window, releases a dove. It finds no place to land. Returns. He waits. Releases a swallow. It returns. Finally, a raven. It doesn't come back. Land is drying. Life is possible again. Atreides makes an offering, burns sacrifice on the mountaintop. The smoke rises, and the gods, hungry now, having not received offerings for 7 days, they gather around the smoke like flies. They're grateful, relieved. They didn't want humanity completely destroyed after all, just quieter, more manageable. And now that one family survived, one righteous man and his household, they can repopulate, do better, live with the knowledge that flood is possible, that divine patience has limits. Enlil is angry at first, seeing survivors, knowing someone warned them, but Enki speaks, defends his action. How could you bring flood without thinking? Lay the sin on the sinner, lay the transgression on the transgressor, but don't destroy everyone. And Enlil, perhaps weary, perhaps recognizing wisdom, accepts humanity will continue, but conditions are imposed. Birth goddesses will limit fertility. Disease and death will keep population manageable. Humans will live shorter lives, die more frequently, never again become so numerous or noisy. The whisper through the wall saved us. Enki's cleverness, his compassion, his refusal to accept that the god's will was fixed and unchangeable, his understanding that law can be honoured while still finding ways to do what's right. This is the secret at Enki's heart, the hidden teaching. That wisdom isn't about following rules blindly, it's about understanding deeper principles. That compassion can coexist with divine order, that saving what you've created, preserving what has value. These things justify bending laws that would destroy indiscriminately. The reed wall still stands in the story. Silent witness. It heard the gods speak. It couldn't help that a human overheard. Walls don't have agency. They're just walls. But they can be vessels for wisdom, channels through which secrets flow, boundaries that are also passages. Enki spoke to a wall, and through that speaking humanity survived. The trickster god, the wise one, the compassionate rebel. He couldn't save everyone, but he saved enough. The seed survived, and from that seed, we grew again. The whisper echoes still, quiet, patient, telling those who know how to listen that wisdom finds a way, that compassion can work within constraints, that the God who made us still, somehow, watches over what he made. Beneath the flood story's surface, hidden in the details of boat building and bird releasing, lie patterns that appear again and again across cultures and millennia. The ark, the mountain, the dove. These aren't just Mesopotamian motifs, they're human motifs, story elements, that recur because they speak to something deep in our collective memory, or our collective imagination. The dimensions of Atrahasis' boat are specific, though they vary slightly between versions. In some texts, it's a cube, 60 metres on each side. In others, more rectangular, but always large, always covered, always pitched with bitumen to make it waterproof. The detail about pitch is interesting. Bitumen was common in Mesopotamia, seeping up from underground deposits, used for waterproofing, for construction, for medicine. Very practical material, very specific to this region. The instruction to make the boat like the Abzu suggests it should be dark inside, enclosed, like the underwater realm where Enki dwells. Perhaps the boat is meant to be a floating Abzu, a piece of the god's realm surviving the flood. The animals and people inside, preserved in darkness and water, waiting to emerge into a renewed world. The animals are important, 2 of each kind, or 7 pairs of clean animals in some versions. The idea that all species must be preserved, that biodiversity matters, that the world after the flood should have the same richness and variety as before. This shows ecological awareness, even if the framework is mythological. How did Atrahasis know which animals to bring? The text doesn't say. Perhaps Enki provided the knowledge. Perhaps the animals came of their own accord, drawn by divine will. Perhaps it's simply understood that a righteous man would know, would have the wisdom to preserve what needs preserving. The loading of the boat is described in some detail. He brought aboard whatever he had of all the creatures, the wild animals of the steppe, the cattle of Shakan, the birds of heaven, all that he brought aboard. Cattle and wild things together, predator and prey, natural enemies coexisting because survival requires cooperation. The boat becomes a space outside normal rules, a floating sanctuary where the usual order is suspended, and then the flood itself. The description is powerful, terrifying, but also cosmic. This isn't just bad weather. This is the unmaking of creation. Sky and earth, those primordial separations, collapse back into undifferentiated water, chaos returning, the ordered world dissolving into the formless deep it came from. The gods' reaction is telling. They're afraid of what they've unleashed. They flee to the highest heaven, to Anu's realm, and cower. This suggests the flood wasn't entirely under control, that even divine power can exceed intention, that once you open the floodgates, you can't always predict what follows. The silence after the storm is profound. Imagine it. 7 days of rain and wind and water pounding against the boat's roof, and then nothing. Stillness. The boat floating in absolute quiet. No sound from outside. No birds, no animals, no human voices, just the gentle lap of water against wood and the breathing of those preserved. Inside, Atrahasis waits. How long? Days. Probably. Weeks. Perhaps. Waiting for the water to recede, for land to appear. For any sign that the world still exists outside the floating Abzu, he's been sealed inside. Finally, he opens a window, releases a dove. This bird is significant. Doves are associated with fertility goddesses, with peace, with messages between realms. The dove flies out, searches, finds nothing but water, returns. The world isn't ready yet. He waits. Days pass. Releases a swallow. Same result. The bird returns. Still too much water, still no place to land. Finally, the raven. Ravens are different birds. Scavengers. Intelligent. Less likely to return if they find any food source at all. The raven leaves and doesn't come back. This is the sign. Land exists. Dry land. Life can begin again. The boat grounds on a mountain. The text names it sometimes. Mount Nisir in the Akkadian version, a real place, or at least a real name. in northern Mesopotamia, in the Zagros mountain range, where floods receding would leave high ground visible first, Atrahasis exits the boat. First thing he does, makes an offering, burns sacrifice to the gods. This is crucial. The first act after catastrophe is worship, gratitude, recognition that survival was divine gift, not human cleverness. Enki helped, yes, but the gods collectively allowed this family to live. The smoke rises, and the gods gather. The image is vivid and surprisingly humble. Gods-like flies around smoke, hungry, drawn by the offering. It's been 7 days since anyone sacrificed to them. 7 days without worship, without the feeding that humans provide. They need us, in a sense. The relationship is more reciprocal than it first appears. Enlil arrives last, sees the survivors, rages. Where did these living beings come from? No one was to survive the destruction. But Enki speaks, calmly, wisely. Punish the wrongdoer for his wrongdoing, yeah, but don't bring flood on everyone. Punish the transgressor for his transgression, but don't destroy the whole world. It's a profound theological statement. Justice should be individual, not collective. Guilt isn't inherited. The many shouldn't suffer for the crimes of the few. This principle, emerging from an ancient flood myth, still resonates, still challenges us when we're tempted toward collective punishment, toward destroying everything because parts are broken. Enlil relents, accepts the argument, or perhaps just accepts reality. Humanity survived. The flood failed to complete its purpose. Starting over means working with what exists. So he blesses Atrahasis and his wife, makes them immortal, sends them to dwell at the mouth of the rivers, in a far place, a kind of paradise where they'll live forever as reward for righteousness and obedience, and humanity repopulates from this one family. This is myth's way of explaining continuity. We all died, but we didn't all die. The species survived, and, from that survival, we grew again. Wiser, perhaps. More aware of divine power. More careful not to make too much noise. The parallels to later flood narratives are obvious. Noah and the Ark. Dimensions given. Animals preserved. Birds released. The Rainbow Covenant. The differences matter too. The details that mark each version as unique. But the pattern holds. Flood. Boat. Righteous man. Divine warning. Salvation of a remnant. Why does this story appear across cultures? Some say it preserves memory of real flooding. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis suggests that around 5600 BCE, rising sea levels breached the Bosporus, flooding what had been a freshwater lake, creating the Black Sea we know today, catastrophic, sudden, killing coastal communities. Perhaps survivors carried the memory, transformed it into myth over millennia. Others point to local floods. Mesopotamia flooded regularly. Archaeological layers at and other cities show massive flood deposits. Not global, deluge, but devastating to those who experienced them. Perhaps one particularly bad flood became the template, the event that all other floods were measured against, the one that entered mythology as the flood, the disaster that almost ended everything. Or perhaps it's archetypal. Water represents chaos. Flood represents chaos, overwhelming order. The boat represents preservation of what matters. The story expresses universal fear. What if everything we've built is washed away? And universal hope. But something survives. The pattern matters because the anxiety it addresses is real and enduring. Whatever the origin, the story persisted. Was told and retold, copied onto tablets, travelled from culture to culture, Mesopotamian to Hebrew to Christian to Islamic, each version adding details, changing emphasis, adapting to new theological frameworks, but preserving the core: flood, warning, ark, survival, renewal. And at the heart of the Mesopotamian version, the oldest version we have in writing, stands Enki, the god who couldn't save everyone but saved someone, who couldn't stop the flood but preserved seeds, who worked within constraints to achieve compassion's goals. The whisper through the wall echoes forward, through millennia, through cultures, through languages and religions, and the slow transformation of myth into scripture into symbol. The god of wisdom speaking, the reed wall hearing, the righteous man obeying, the dove flying, the ark floating, and us, 5,000 years later, still listening, still hearing in that ancient whisper something that speaks to our deepest fears and highest hopes. That wisdom finds a way, that compassion persists, that what matters can be preserved even when everything else is lost. The story waits in clay tablets, patient, silent, holding the memory of flood and salvation, of divine rebellion and human obedience, of the moment when one God's love for his creation led him to bend rules, to find loopholes as to whisper secrets that saved the world. The question haunts every reader of the ancient texts. Why did the gods send the flood? What made Enlil decide that humanity, noisy humanity, troublesome humanity, needed to be washed away entirely? The Atrahasis epic gives a reason: noise. The people became too numerous. The country was bellowing like a bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their clamour. He said to the great gods, "The uproar of mankind has become too much. I am losing sleep over their racket." It seems trivial. Genocidal divine rage because humans are too loud? Because a god can't sleep? This troubles modern readers. We want better reasons, moral reasons, humanity's wickedness, corruption, violence, something that justifies such extreme response. But perhaps noise is more than literal sound. Perhaps it's metaphor. Some scholars suggest noise represents civilization itself, cities growing, populations expanding, humanity becoming too powerful, too numerous, too independent. The gods created us to serve, and we're succeeding too well, multiplying, spreading, becoming almost rival to divine authority. Perhaps Enlil's insomnia represents divine anxiety. The gods realizing their servants might outgrow their service, might become threats. The flood then becomes preventive measure. Cut humanity down before we get too big, too capable, too autonomous. Others point to environmental factors. Mesopotamia did flood, catastrophically. Archaeological evidence confirms this. Layers of water-deposited clay appear in the stratigraphic record at Ur, at Shuruppak, at other ancient cities, not at the same time, not universally. But floods happened, destroyed cities, killed thousands. Perhaps the myth preserves memory of one particularly devastating flood, or several floods merged into one narrative. The theological explanation, gods sent it, makes sense in a world where natural disasters need divine explanation. Nothing happens by chance. If cities drown, someone chose to drown them. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis offers another possibility. Around 5600 BCE, according to some geologists, rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus Strait. Salt water poured into what had been a freshwater lake. The lake level rose catastrophically, perhaps 140 metres over months or years. Coastal communities were inundated. Survivors fled, carried memories of water rising, cities drowning, everything lost. If that memory entered Mesopotamian tradition somehow, through migrations, through shared cultural heritage, it could have become the template for flood mythology. The actual event, real and traumatic, transformed over millennia into divine punishment, into cosmic reset, into the story that explained why everything changed. But we may never know if the Black Sea flood connects to Mesopotamian myth. The timeline is uncertain, the cultural transmission mechanism unclear. It's possible, plausible, but unprovable with current evidence. Perhaps the flood myth isn't about remembering a specific event at all. Perhaps it's archetypal, universal. Almost every culture has flood myths. Greek, Hindu, Chinese, Norse, Native American, African. The details vary, but the pattern holds. Great waters, destruction, survival of a remnant, renewal. Carl Jung would say this reflects the collective unconscious. Universal human anxiety about chaos overwhelming order. Water represents the unconscious, the formless, the undifferentiated potential from which consciousness emerges. Flood is that potential returning, threatening to dissolve what ego has built. The arc is preservation of consciousness through the ordeal. The emergence afterward is rebirth, integration, renewal. Maybe. Maybe flood myths are psychological rather than historical, expressing inner realities through outer metaphors. The great washing away isn't literal but symbolic, represents transformation, death of old self, emergence of new, or maybe it's simpler. Floods happen, always have. They're terrifying, destructive, seemingly arbitrary in what they destroy and what they spare. Ancient peoples explaining floods naturally invoked divine will, and one particularly bad flood, or the general phenomenon of flooding, became mythologized into a universal deluge. The theological questions are harder. If the gods sent the flood, why? What does it say about divine nature that genocide was chosen as solution to noise? Some scholars see it as primitive theology, early humans projecting onto gods their own pettiness, their own capacity for overreaction. The gods are powerful, but not necessarily good, not moral in ways humans would recognize. They act from self-interest, from irritation, from whim. Others argue it reflects real theological sophistication. The story critiques divine behavior. Enki's objection, punish the wrongdoer for his wrongdoing, but don't destroy everyone, becomes the text's moral center. The wisdom god speaks truth to power, argues for proportional justice, for mercy. The story doesn't celebrate the flood, it questions it. Perhaps that's the deeper teaching. That power, even divine power, can be wrong, can be excessive, can be tempered by wisdom and compassion. Enki represents the principle that authority isn't always right, that rules can be unjust, that finding ways around unjust rules, whispering through walls, saving what deserves saving, this is righteousness. The parallels to biblical flood narrative raise questions too. Genesis clearly drew from Mesopotamian sources. The similarities are too numerous for independent origin, but Genesis changes key details. In the biblical version, God sends the flood because humanity is wicked. Violence fills the earth. This is moral justification. Still harsh, but at least comprehensible. Noah is righteous, found favour in God's eyes. That's why he's saved. Not because a god found a loophole, but because God directly chose to preserve one good family. The theology is clearer, more monotheistic, less polytheistic chaos. But the older version, the Mesopotamian version, is messier, more human in its divine politics. Gods arguing, Enki scheming, Enlil raging. The moral clarity is absent, or rather, it emerges not from divine decree but from Enki's compassionate rebellion, the god who loves his creations enough to save them despite divine law. Which version is truer? Historically, the Mesopotamian version is older, earlier, closer to whatever original inspired both. But truth isn't just chronological. Both versions carry truth. The Mesopotamian one truthfully portrays a complex moral universe where good requires cleverness and defiance. The biblical one truthfully portrays a universe where moral order comes from divine character. We may never know what historical event, if any, lies behind the myth. We may never fully understand why the story was told this way. Why Enlil's insomnia justifies genocide. Why Enki's compassion requires deception. Why humanity survives only through a whispered secret. But perhaps the uncertainty is valuable. Perhaps the multiple possible interpretations, historical and psychological and theological. Perhaps this richness is itself the point. The story functions on multiple levels, preserves multiple truths, can be read in multiple ways depending on what the reader needs. A person traumatized by flood finds validation. Their disaster was real, others survived, life continued. A person wrestling with unjust authority finds encouragement. Even gods can be questioned. Wisdom finds ways around tyranny. A person seeking meaning in suffering finds possibility. Maybe there's purpose. Maybe something worth preserving emerges. The clay tablets hold the story. Silent now. Patient. They don't insist on single interpretation. Don't demand we solve the mystery. They just preserve the words, the ancient account, the oldest flood narrative we have in writing. And they let us wonder, let us question, let us bring our own needs and context to the reading. Perhaps that's wisdom too, the wisdom of the God who dwells in depths, who knows that truth is fluid, that answers change depending on who's asking. That mystery preserved is often more valuable than mystery solved. The flood came, or floods came, or the idea of flood, cosmic and cleansing and terrifying, came into human consciousness and stayed there. And someone, some Sumerian scribe 5,000 years ago, pressed the story into clay, made it permanent, gave it to the future. We inherit that gift. The story survives. The questions persist. and somewhere beneath the earth, in waters that flow still, the god of wisdom watches, knows, understands, and keeps his counsel. The mystery remains, and perhaps, just perhaps, that's exactly as it should be. As empires rose and fell, as Sumer gave way to Akkad, as Akkad gave way to Babylon, as Babylon gave way to Assyria, the gods transformed, not disappeared, but changed, merged, took on new names while keeping old characteristics. Enki was no exception. In Akkadian, the Semitic language that eventually dominated Mesopotamia, Enki became Ea, pronounced Ea, the same god, same domain, same personality, but wearing a new linguistic coat. The name change reflects conquest, cultural shift, the natural evolution of religious traditions when populations mix. But the stories persisted. The Akkadian versions of the flood narrative, the Atrahasis epic, the Gilgamesh epic, these preserve Ea Enki in his familiar role, god of wisdom, god of the Abzu, the one who saves humanity. The texts are later, dating to the 2nd millennium BCE, but they draw on older Sumerian sources, their translations, adaptations, continuing traditions that go back to Sumer's earliest days. Beyond Mesopotamia, influences become harder to trace. Did Enki's myths spread to other cultures? Did similar deities develop independently? Or is there some common source, now lost, that fed multiple traditions? The Greek Prometheus shows interesting parallels. Prometheus is a trickster god who loves humanity, who steals fire from Zeus and gives it to mortals, who teaches civilizations arts, who's punished for helping Humana bound to a rock, tormented eternally, but who never regrets his choice. Some scholars see Mesopotamian influence, perhaps through Phoenician intermediaries, perhaps through cultural contacts in the Eastern Mediterranean. The stories are similar enough to suggest connection, trickster deity, theft of divine knowledge, gift to humanity, punishment by supreme god. Perhaps Prometheus descends, in part, from Enki, or perhaps both descend from something older. The biblical tradition shows clearer connections. Genesis's flood narrative borrowed extensively from Mesopotamian sources. This is accepted by most scholars now. The parallels are too exact for coincidence. Noah is Atrahasis Utnapishtim. The ark is the boat. The dove is the dove. Even specific phrases appear in both. But Genesis changes the theology, removes the polytheism, makes God sovereign rather than conflicted. Noah isn't saved through a god's deception, but through God's direct choice. The moral framework shifts from divine politics to divine judgment and mercy. Does Enki appear in biblical tradition? Not by name, but perhaps in concept. The serpent in Eden, often read as evil, could be seen differently. The serpent teaches knowledge, makes humans aware, breaks divine prohibition to grant wisdom. These are Enki-like qualities. Trickster helping humanity gain knowledge despite divine law. Some Jewish mystical traditions identified the serpent with Samael or other angels of knowledge. Others simply made it evil incarnate, but the ambiguity remains. The serpent gave knowledge, made humans like gods, knowing good and evil. Is that temptation or gift? Perhaps the answer depends on whether you value obedience or wisdom more. The dove in Noah's Ark might also carry echoes. Doves in Mesopotamian tradition were sacred to Ishtar, Inanna, goddess associated with Enki, in complex mythological relationships. The dove as messenger, a sign of a life returning, this appears in both Mesopotamian and biblical flood narratives. Cultural transmission, or archetypal symbolism, perhaps both. Islamic tradition preserves flood narratives too. Noah appears in the Quran. The details differ from Genesis in places, match it in others. Some Islamic scholars were aware of older Mesopotamian versions. Medieval Arab writers had access to ancient sources now lost. Whether they connected Noah back to Atrahasis, back to Enki's whispered warning, we don't know. But the possibility existed. The figure of Khidr in Islamic mysticism shows interesting parallels to Enki. Khidr is the mysterious guide who appears to Moses in Surah Al-Kahf. He acts in ways that seem wrong, morally ambiguous, but prove wise when explained. He has hidden knowledge, lives in liminal spaces, acts from wisdom ordinary people can't comprehend. Some scholars see pre-Islamic influences. Perhaps Khedr draws on older Middle Eastern traditions of trickster wisdom gods. Perhaps somewhere in his literary ancestry, Enki whispers, the god who dwells in water, who knows secrets, who helps humanity through indirect means. Hindu mythology has Matsya, the fish avatar of Vishnu, who warns Manu of coming flood, tells him to build a boat, save seeds of all living things. The parallels are striking. Fish god, flood warning, salvation of righteous man. Is this independent development? Cultural contact through ancient trade routes, or archetypal pattern emerging independently? We may never know. The timelines are uncertain. The cultural transmission mechanisms unclear, but the possibility of connection exists. Mythologies influence each other. Stories travel with traders and conquerors and pilgrims. Ancient cosmopolitan cities mixed populations and ideas. What started in Sumer might have echoed across continents. The trickster archetype itself appears globally. Anansi in West African tradition, Coyote among Native Americans, Loki in Norse mythology, Maui in Polynesian tales. Each culture has its clever deity who breaks rules, helps humanity, causes trouble, serves as boundary crosser between divine and mortal realms. Perhaps Enki is one expression of a universal pattern, the human need for a god who understands our limitations, who doesn't demand perfection, who works with us rather than merely commanding us, who's willing to bend rules when rigid law would cause harm. That pattern resonates because it addresses real human experience. We live in worlds of competing demands. Divine law and human need don't always align. Sometimes doing right requires breaking rules. Sometimes wisdom means finding loopholes. Sometimes compassion demands defiance. Enki validates that complexity. Doesn't resolve it, but validates it. Says it's okay to be clever. Okay to question authority. Okay to save what deserves saving, even when commanded to let it die. He's the god for people caught between, for those navigating moral grey areas, for humans trying to be good in systems that aren't always just. That's his legacy. Not just specific stories, though those matter. Not just flood narrative, though that survived longest. But a pattern, a possibility, a divine character who embodies wisdom without abandoning compassion, authority without demanding blind obedience, power expressed through creativity rather than force. The Mesopotamian civilizations fell, their cities were abandoned, their temples crumbled, their languages died. For 2,000 years, no one could read cuneiform, the tablets lay buried, silent, holding stories no one could access, but the patterns persisted through cultural transmission, through archetypal resonance, through the simple fact that human nature doesn't change much. We still need trickster gods, still need divine rebels, still need figures who love us enough to whisper secrets, to find loopholes, to save what can be saved. Enki's name was forgotten, but his echo continued, in Prometheus, in the serpent, in Khidr, in countless trickster tales told around fires in every culture. The details changed, the theology shifted, but something remained. The god in the water, the wise one, the one who whispered through walls. And now, thanks to archaeology and linguistics and patient scholarship, we can read the original tablets again, can hear the stories in their earliest form, can meet Enki himself, not his echoes but the source, the Sumerian god who dwelled in the Abzu and loved humanity enough to break divine law. The legacy is both specific and universal, the particular and the archetypal, the ancient and the eternal. 5,000 years after his stories were first written, Enki still speaks, still whispers, still teaches those willing to descend to the depths, to listen in silence, to hear what wisdom offers from the waters beneath the earth. The temples fell silent, not suddenly, not in a single catastrophic moment, but gradually, over centuries, as empires shifted and populations moved and new gods demanded attention. The last offerings were made, the last prayers spoken, the last priest died without successors, and the Abzu at Eridu, Enki's house for 3,000 years, crumbled slowly back into the earth it rose from. The language died too. Sumerian ceased to be spoken by the late 3rd millennium BCE, became a liturgical language, like Latin in medieval Europe, used in temples and schools but not in homes or markets. By the time Babylon fell to Persia in 539 BCE, even the liturgical use had mostly ended. The last people who could read Sumerian, who could speak it, who remembered what the words meant, they passed into silence. The tablets remained, buried in temple ruins and palace libraries, scattered across tells, those artificial hills created by generations of human occupation, from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of Anatolia. Thousands of clay tablets, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, each one fired hard by ancient kilns or by the fires that destroyed the buildings holding them, preserved by the very catastrophes that ended their use. For 2,000 years, no one could read them. No one even recognized them as writing. The wedge marks looked decorative, ornamental. Ancient peoples had buried bricks with strange patterns. That's all anyone knew. The stories pressed into those tablets, the myths and laws and astronomical observations and business records. All of it was silent, waiting, patient as clay has always been. But memory survived in other ways. The flood narrative travelled, from Mesopotamia to Hebrew tradition to Christian, scripture to Islamic teaching, transformed, certainly, reinterpreted through new theological frameworks, but recognizably descended from the story pressed into tablets at Nineveh and Ur and Eridu. The whisper through the wall echoed forward, changing form but never quite dying. Greek authors preserved fragments. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 BCE, recorded Mesopotamian traditions, including flood stories, including references to gods teaching humanity civilization's arts. His works mostly vanished, but later authors quoted them. Preserved pieces, kept threads of memory alive even when the full tapestry was lost. The rediscovery began in the 19th century. European archaeologists and adventurers descending on the Middle East, looking for biblical confirmation, for museum treasures, for glory and knowledge, and whatever could be found in the dust of millennia. They dug at Nineveh, at Babylon, at Ur, and they found tablets, lots of tablets, clay, rectangles covered with mysterious marks. Henry Rawlinson, British officer and scholar, spent years copying the Behistun inscription, that massive trilingual text carved into a cliff face in Persia. Old Persian, Elamite, Akkadian. By comparing the versions, by using the partially understood Old Persian as key, he began unlocking cuneiform. By the 1850s, scholars could read Akkadian, the Semitic language of Babylon and Assyria. Sumerian took longer. It appeared in bilingual tablets, Sumerian-Akkadian dictionaries created by ancient scribes preserving a language already dead in their time. Gradually, painstakingly, the grammar was reconstructed, the vocabulary assembled. By the early 20th century, Sumerian could be read again. The silence was broken. George Smith, that British museum engraver, found the flood tablet in 1872. Part of the Gilgamesh epic, the Akkadian version featuring Utnapishtim and the deluge. When he realized what he was reading, when he saw the parallels to Genesis, he reportedly tore off his clothes in excitement. The story might be exaggerated, but the impact was real. Biblical narratives had older sources. The foundations of Western religion reached back into Mesopotamian clay. More tablets emerged, the Atrahasis epic, the Eridu Genesis, multiple versions of the flood story, each adding details, each showing how the narrative evolved over millennia. And in all of them, Enki, or Ea in the later versions, the god who warned humanity, who found the loophole, who saved what he had created. Excavations at Eridu in the 1940s and 50s revealed the temple sequence, those 18 successive structures built one atop another, evidence of continuous worship spanning 2,000 years. The deepest levels, the earliest temples, dated to 5000 BCE or earlier. Eridu really was one of the oldest cities. The claim wasn't just mythological. Archaeology confirmed it. Even now, tablets are being translated, museums and universities hold collections requiring decades of work. New fragments are matched with old, completing texts previously known only in pieces. Digital humanities projects catalogue everything, creating searchable databases, making ancient literature accessible in ways never before possible. Even now, new discoveries happen. In 2015, the Suleymaniye Museum in Iraqi Kurdistan revealed a tablet they'd acquired, a previously unknown portion of the Gilgamesh flood narrative, different wording from the standard version, new details about the ark's construction. After 5,000 years, the text still isn't completely recovered, still yielding surprises. Still today, scholars debate interpretations. What did specific words mean? How should grammar be understood? What cultural context shaped these narratives? The answers aren't settled, probably never will be completely. Language is fluid, meaning is contextual. Reading across 5 millennia requires humility, acknowledgement, that perfect understanding is impossible. But we know more than we did. We've recovered Enki from oblivion. We can read his stories in their original languages. We can trace his evolution from Sumerian to Akkadian to the cultural influences spreading outward. We can see him whole as fragmented tablets allow. The continuity is profound. The same stars that watched Sumerian astronomers, that guided priests calculating festival dates, that witnessed rituals in the Iabzu courtyard, those stars still wheel overhead, barely shifted in their positions. The constellations the Sumerians named, some of those names persist. The bull of heaven is Taurus. The 7 gods might be the Pleiades. The patterns they saw, we see. The rivers still flow. The Tigris and Euphrates, though diminished by dams and irrigation, still carry mountain water to the Persian Gulf. The landscape has changed, desertified in places where marshlands once spread. But the basic geography remains. You can stand where Eridu stood, where the Iabzu rose for 2,000 years, and feel the connection. Stone and clay, water and sky, past and present meeting, the Iraqi marshes, the great wetlands of southern Mesopotamia where Enki's myths were born. Those were nearly destroyed in the late 20th century. Saddam Hussein drained them deliberately, punishing marsh Arabs who opposed him. The ecosystem collapsed. Ancient ways of life ended. It seemed like final catastrophe. The waters Enki governed, gone. But water finds a way. After Hussein's fall, some marshes were reflooded. Wildlife returned. Reed beds grew again. People returned to their traditional lifestyle. Not completely restored, not as it was, but alive, surviving. The marshlands where civilization began, where gods were first imagined dwelling in waters beneath earth, those places persist, resilient, patient. Perhaps that's Enki's truest legacy. Not specific myths, though those matter. Not temple ruins, though they witness. But the pattern, the persistence, the way wisdom flows like water, finding channels, surviving catastrophe, emerging again when conditions allow. We inherit more than stories. We inherit questions. What does it mean to be wise? How do we balance obedience and conscience? When is breaking rules the right thing? How do we love what we've created enough to preserve it? These are Enki's questions, the ones his myths explore, the ones that made Sumerian priests copy his stories century after century. We inherit the gift of writing too, that particular magic, capturing speech in visible marks, preserving thought across time. Enki didn't invent writing historically, but mythologically, he's credited with giving it to humanity, teaching us to press meaning into clay. And here we are, 5,000 years later, still reading what was pressed, still receiving the gift. The story continues in us, in everyone who reads the tablets, who studies the myths, who wonders about the God who whispered through walls. We become vessels for the tradition, carriers of memory. The whisper reaches us, faint across millennia, and we hear it, we preserve it, we pass it forward. Perhaps that's what Enki would want, not worship. That age has passed, not offerings of fish and beer, those rituals ended, but remembrance, understanding, the recognition that wisdom matters, that compassion matters, that finding ways to preserve what has value matters even when authority commands destruction. The tablets wait in their museum cases, climate-controlled now, protected, studied with tools the ancient scribes couldn't imagine. Digital photography, spectrographic analysis, computer-aided translation. We bring new techniques to old texts, extract information previously hidden, find patterns in word frequencies, reconstruct damaged passages by comparing multiple copies, but the essence remains unchanged, clay pressed with reeds, wedge marks preserving words, stories told 5,000 years ago still speaking to those who take time to listen. Enki and the Abzu, the flood warning, the ark floating, humanity saved by a whispered secret, the God who loved us enough to break rules, who valued creation enough to preserve it, who understood that sometimes wisdom requires working around authority, that sometimes compassion demands cleverness, that sometimes the right thing and the commanded thing aren't the same. These lessons don't age. The specific context, Sumerian gods and Mesopotamian floods, that's historical, but the patterns are eternal, human, still relevant, still teaching those willing to learn. The legacy lives in tablets and translations, in scholarship and storytelling, in the continuing effort to understand who we were, where we came from, what our ancestors believed and why, in the recognition that the past speaks if we learn its language, that silence can be broken, that what was forgotten can be remembered. Even now, somewhere, a scholar sits with a fragment, brushing away dust, photographing under raking light, comparing with other texts, trying to read what was written when Sumer flourished, trying to hear voices silent for millennia, trying to bring Enki and his stories back into awareness. The work continues. The tablets yield their secrets slowly, and the God who dwells in depths, who knows that wisdom flows from hidden sources, who understands that patience and persistence matter more than speed, he waits, as he always has, as clay waits, as water waits, as truth waits, for those ready to descend, to seek, to listen, to receive what the depths offer. The whisper continues, faint but audible, ancient but present, waiting for ears that know how to hear, and so we return. Back to this moment, back to wherever you are, listening to this now, back to the present, which is all any of us ever truly inhabit. The marshlands of southern Iraq still hold reeds, tall green stalks, the same species that grew when Eridu flourished, the same reeds that formed walls Enki whispered through. They rustle in wind unchanged by millennia. They grow from water, from earth, from the meeting of elements that made this landscape sacred 5,000 years ago and makes it sacred still. The rivers still flow, diminished, yes, dammed and diverted, but the Tigris and Euphrates still carry mountain water toward the Gulf, still deposit silt, still flood when heavy rains come. The pattern continues. The gift of water, Enki's gift, still sustains life in an arid land. The tablets rest in their museums, in London and Baghdad and Philadelphia and Berlin, small rectangles of baked clay covered with wedge marks, holding stories pressed into them when the world was young. They don't speak aloud, don't insist on attention, they just wait. Patient as clay has always been. Patient as the God who dwells in depths. Scholars still read them, still find new fragments, still debate meanings. The work of translation, of interpretation, of understanding, this continues, slowly, carefully, with humility before mystery. The ancient voices speak, but softly. Through static of time and language and cultural distance, we hear them, imperfectly, but we hear. Take a breath. The stars above Mesopotamia are the same stars, barely shifted in their positions across 5 millennia. The constellations the Sumerians watched, calculated, wove into their understanding of divine order. Those patterns still wheel overhead, unchanged, eternal, indifferent to human civilizations rising and falling beneath them like waves. We don't know everything about Enki. We never will. The tablets are fragmentary. The context is lost. The lived experience of Sumerian religion, the feeling of standing in the Iabzu courtyard, the sound of hymns sung in a dead language, the taste of beer offered to the god. All of that is gone, irrecoverable, lost in the silence between then and now. But we know enough. We know he was the god of wisdom, of water, of creative intelligence. We know he taught humanity civilization's arts. We know he loved his creations enough to save them, even at risk of divine anger. We know he whispered through walls because direct speech was forbidden. We know the story mattered enough to be copied and recopied, told and retold, preserved through empires and languages and the slow transformation of memory into myth into scripture. Perhaps that's sufficient. Perhaps the gaps, the uncertainties, the mysteries we can't solve. Perhaps these are valuable too. They keep us humble. keep us wondering, keep us approaching the past with respect rather than certainty, with questions rather than answers. The God who dwells in depths would understand, would approve, maybe. Wisdom isn't about knowing everything. It's about understanding what you don't know, recognizing limits, working within constraints, finding creative solutions when direct paths are blocked. We stand at a distance, 5,000 years removed, speaking different languages, living in different world, but the connection holds. The whisper reaches us. Faint, yes. Filtered through time and translation and cultural transformation, but audible if we listen, if we quiet ourselves enough to hear. And perhaps in that listening, in that patient attention to ancient voices, in that willingness to descend into depths of time and seek what's hidden there, perhaps we participate in Enki's legacy. We become, in small way, like the God who valued knowledge, who preserved what mattered, who taught and listened and found ways. The night settles wherever you are. Maybe you're tired now. Maybe sleep is close. Maybe you've drifted in and out, caught pieces of this story. Let other pieces flow past like water you can't hold. That's fine. That's how it should be. This isn't information to be mastered. It's a current to float in, a depth to rest upon. Somewhere in Iraq, on land that once held Eridu, the soil still holds traces, fragments of brick, shards of pottery, tablets not yet discovered. The ruins have been partially excavated, then reburied to protect them. The tell rises, artificial hill made of human history, silent witness to centuries of worship and offering, and the daily life of people who believed gods walked among them. The site is remote, difficult to reach. Few visitors come, but it exists, it endures. The place where Enki's temple stood for 2,000 years, where his priests maintained rituals, where his devotees brought fish and beer and prayers, that ground remains, sacred, perhaps, or simply patient, holding what it holds, remembering what stone and earth remember. The waters beneath still flow, the aquifer, the real Abzu, source of springs and wells, underground rivers moving through darkness, carrying ancient rain toward the surface, patient, eternal, indifferent to our theologies but sustaining our lives nonetheless. Perhaps that's the deepest truth. Water flows, always has, always will. We give it names, call it sacred or mundane, invoke gods to explain it, build civilizations depending on it, but it just flows, from source to sea, from depth to surface, from mystery to use, and in that flowing, in that patient movement through channels seen and unseen, perhaps there is wisdom, Enki's wisdom, the wisdom of adaptation, of finding ways, of flowing around obstacles, of seeping through cracks, of never stopping, never holding still, always moving toward where you're meant to go. The story doesn't end, can't end, because it's not really about ancient gods and vanished civilizations. It's about patterns, about questions that persist, about the human need for meaning, for connection, for gods who understand us, for wisdom that saves rather than condemns. Those needs don't age, don't vanish, don't become obsolete. We still seek, still wonder, still hope that somewhere, in depths we can't see, wisdom waits, ready to whisper, ready to teach, ready to preserve what deserves preserving. The tablets hold their words, the rivers flow their courses, the reeds grow and die and grow again, the stars wheel, the night deepens, and somewhere, in the silence between heartbeats, in the space where breath and thought meet, the ancient voices continue, not speaking, exactly, not commanding attention, just present, available, waiting for those who descend, who listen, who seek what the depths offer, the whisper through the wall, the secret that saves, the wisdom that flows like water, still there, still patient, still, always, waiting. If tonight you heard the whisper through the wall, if Enki's wisdom spoke to you across 5,000 years, consider subscribing. There are more ancient gods waiting in the depths, more sacred stories pressed into clay, more nights we can wander together, through time's patient silence. Your presence here matters.